It began in darkness, in a forest buried beneath snow, beneath silence, beneath the illusion of peace. The Ardennes in December 1944 were a world asleep, a maze of frozen pines and narrow roads, where soldiers of the Allied armies huddled in their foxholes, weary and half-believing the war was nearly done. The Normandy landings were a victory, Paris was liberated, and the German army, they thought, was finished. The front in Belgium was called the Ghost Sector, a quiet line where green American divisions were sent to rest. But beneath the calm, in the forests beyond the Siegfried Line, engines were rumbling, thousands of them. Tanks, half-tracks and trucks, hidden under camouflage nets, their crews waiting in the cold, and among them, standing before a map spread across a snow-covered table, was Adolf Hitler, clinging to a fantasy that one bold strike could turn defeat into deliverance. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's final gamble in the West, the last great throw of the dice in a war he had already lost. The plan was madness and genius. Hitler envisioned a massive surprise assault through the Ardennes, the same forest where his armies had triumphed in 1940. The goal to split the Allied front, drive through Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. With the British and American forces cut in two, he hoped to force a separate peace with the West and turn his full attention back to the Soviets in the East. It was a desperate dream, born not of strategy, but of denial. Yet for all its delusion, the operation was executed with chilling precision. Under a veil of secrecy, 3 German armies, the Sixth SS Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, the Fifth Panzer Army, under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the Seventh Army, under Erich Brandenberger, gathered nearly 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks. Among them were the Waffen-SS elite, the last of Germany's seasoned troops, and countless teenage conscripts pressed into service. They were ordered to attack through fog, through snow, through the very heart of winter, and to do the impossible. In the early hours of December 16th, the forest exploded. Over 2,000 German artillery guns opened fire, shaking the ground from Monschau to Luxembourg. The shells tore through the stillness of the dawn, blasting apart American positions along an 85-mile front. Out of the smoke and snow came the assault troops, grey uniforms blending into the mist, their boots crunching on frozen ground. They struck without warning, smashing into thinly held lines manned by the 8th Corps, the 99th, the 106th, and the 28th Infantry Divisions. In hours the front collapsed. American outposts vanished, communications broke down, and entire regiments were encircled. Panic spread through the Ardennes like wildfire. For the first time since Normandy, the Western Front was broken open. From the north came Dietrich's Sixth SS Panzer Army, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Peiper, a vanguard of black uniformed tanks that cut through villages and forests, leaving behind trails of destruction and infamy. From the center, Manteuffel's Fifth Panzer Army surged forward, its armored columns threading through the misty valleys of the Our River and Clairvaux. To the south, Brandenberger's Seventh Army guarded the flank, stretching thin across Luxembourg. The Germans advanced faster than anyone thought possible, over 20 miles in the first 2 days. Bridges fell intact into their hands, roads clogged with retreating convoys, and entire American units were swallowed by the onslaught. The snow turned grey with smoke and red with blood. But amid the chaos, there were those who refused to break. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions dug in, holding the high ground against the full fury of the SS. Artillery thundered across the hills, turning the slopes into a graveyard of tanks. The ridge would become the northern anchor of the Allied defence, the place where the Bulge broke. Further south at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was surrounded. Cut off, freezing and outnumbered, the paratroopers held their ground as German tanks encircled the town. When ordered to surrender, McAuliffe's reply was one word: nuts. It became the rallying cry of the battle. The fighting in the Ardennes was unlike anything the Western Front had seen before. The snow muffled sound but amplified terror. Tanks skidded on ice-covered roads. Men froze to death in foxholes as they fired through blizzards. Fog grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Germans precious days of freedom to move unseen. The forests became a labyrinth of ambushes and confusion, where American and German patrols stumbled into each other in the mist, fighting hand to hand in the dark. Supplies were scarce, ammunition short, and every hill, every crossroads, every bridge became a battle in itself. Yet even as the German spearheads advanced, their fatal flaw was already unfolding: fuel. The panzers could move no faster than the fuel trucks that followed them, and those trucks were running dry. Allied air superiority, grounded in the storm's early days, returned with vengeance when the skies cleared on December 23rd. Swarms of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons swept across the snowfields, strafing convoys, bombing fuel depots, and turning the roads into twisted ribbons of fire. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Columns of armor were abandoned, their crews forced to fight on foot. Hitler's dream of reaching Antwerp dissolved in smoke. By Christmas Eve, the offensive had lost its momentum. The great Bulge carved into the Allied lines, from St. Vith to Hoffelise, from Bastogne to Malmedy, had reached its peak, but it was now a trap. General Patton's Third Army, executing one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war, wheeled northward in a winter storm, striking the German flank and relieving Bastogne on December 26th. The once mighty offensive was collapsing. The Allied counterattack began in January, pushing relentlessly eastward through the same forests the Germans had conquered weeks before. By January 25th, 1945, the line was restored. The bulge in the map, Hitler's last victory, was gone. The cost was staggering. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men, their last reserves of armor and fuel, and any hope of stopping the Allied advance. For the Americans, the price was even higher: 89,000 casualties, the bloodiest battle the US Army would fight in Europe. The Ardennes was not just a battle, it was a crucible. It tested every man who fought there, their endurance, their courage, their faith. It was a battle fought not only against an enemy, but against the cold, the fear, and the dying illusion that the war would end easily. The Ardennes Offensive, known forever as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last throw of the dice, his winter gamble. It was born of desperation, executed with brilliance and doomed by reality. In the end, it achieved nothing but hastened the fall of the Reich. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the burning ruins of Berlin, the road from that December led only one way: to the end. Today, the Ardennes are peaceful again. The forests are quiet, the villages rebuilt. The snow falls over fields that once echoed with artillery, covering the scars of a battle that shaped the world's future. Beneath the trees, in forgotten clearings, rusted helmets and shell fragments still rest, buried in silence, relics of a time when the forest itself seemed alive with fury. The story of the Ardennes is not just about tanks and generals, it is about endurance, about men who stood their ground in the darkest winter of the war. It is about the moment when a dying empire tried one last time to defy fate and failed. Tonight we return to those frozen woods, to the quiet before the storm, to the thunder that followed, and to the courage that endured when everything else was buried beneath snow. This is the entire history of the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's winter gamble, the last great battle of the Western Front, and the moment when the Third Reich's end began to take shape in the cold white silence of the Ardennes. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening under calm skies, far from the frozen forests of Europe, or can you almost feel the snow beneath your feet as history stirs once more? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. September 19th, 1944, the shattered city of Aachen, Germany. The first German city to face Allied artillery lay in ruins, its streets choked with burned-out Kubel wagons and twisted tram lines. Across the Rhine, the remnants of the Fifth Panzer Army dragged what armor they could across pontoon bridges under the cover of fog. In Versailles, 500 kilometers to the west, General Dwight D. Eisenhower studied aerial reconnaissance from the 9th Air Force, showing German formations dissolving into chaos. The Allies had advanced 1,000 kilometers in less than 3 months since the Normandy breakout. Yet behind the maps and statistics, a different kind of fatigue set in: logistical paralysis. Fuel convoys stretched from Cherbourg to Liège. Tank crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned French cars to keep their Shermans moving. The front stretched 600 miles, too long, too exposed, and too sure of victory. Inside the Château de Versailles, headquarters of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, the air smelled of tobacco and stale coffee. Eisenhower, flanked by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, reviewed the Red Ball Express tonnage reports. The American supply network, designed for a 50-day campaign, was now feeding 40 divisions spread across Western Europe. Trains could deliver only 10,000 tons of fuel per day, when field consumption demanded 16,000. The difference bled directly into stalled tank columns on the Siegfried Line. Eisenhower's chief logistician, Major General John C. H. Lee, warned that the entire front risked starvation, not of food but of motion. Without fuel, momentum, the Allies' greatest weapon, would die before the Rhine. Montgomery's narrow front plan clashed violently with Bradley's broad front strategy. Montgomery demanded concentration of resources for a single thrust into the rear, claiming it would end the war before Christmas. Bradley countered that such a thrust would expose American flanks stretching from Luxembourg to the Moselle. The disagreement, documented in SHAF Memorandum Noma 77, revealed the cracks in Allied unity. Eisenhower sought compromise, a dual advance both north and south of the Ardennes. It seemed reasonable, even cautious. Yet that compromise left the central sector, the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, garrisoned by inexperienced or exhausted divisions. The stage for disaster was quietly set. In stark contrast, 800 kilometers to the east, Adolf Hitler sat inside the Wolf's Schanze, the Wolf's Lair, near Rastenburg, East Prussia. On September 16th, his adjutant recorded in his diary that the Führer spoke of a counterblow to drive the Anglo-Americans into the sea. The remark was delusional. Army Group B had lost 45% of its armoured strength during the Falaise encirclement. The 12th SS Panzer Division, once boasting 100 Panthers, now fielded fewer than 20 operational tanks. Yet Hitler's mind converted these figures not into limitation, but into defiance. He ordered General Alfred Jodl to draft a plan that would repeat the miracle of 1940. In his mind, the impossible was not improbable, it was destiny deferred. German High Command reports from September 28th, codenamed Liege Ost-West Enjor 1944 ninths, painted a grim reality. Ammunition reserves for artillery were at 40% of pre-Normandy levels. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, had fewer than 500 serviceable fighters west of the Rhine. Even the vaunted Tiger II tanks, each weighing 70 tons and consuming 5 liters of fuel per kilometer, were immobile monuments to industrial exhaustion. Albert Speer's armaments ministry projected steel shortages reaching critical thresholds by December. Yet these hard numbers met a political command system that no longer obeyed arithmetic. Hitler demanded faith where he lacked resources, willpower where he lacked oil. Eisenhower's intelligence officers, particularly Colonel Oskar Koch of the Third Army G2 section, noticed the pattern of German desperation. Koch warned that the Wehrmacht's apparent collapse was deceptive, a pause masking regrouping. His report dated October 1st predicted a limited counteroffensive, possibly along the Ardennes corridor. The document was circulated, but dismissed as overcautious. Allied aerial reconnaissance detected no troop concentrations, largely because the Luftwaffe's withdrawal had grounded Allied photo flights for days. The silence was interpreted as confirmation of weakness. In reality, that silence was cover. Hitler's deception plan, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was already being shaped in the forests east of the Rhine. In the Allied rear areas, soldiers prepared for what they believed would be a quiet winter. Field kitchens set up near Spa and Malmedy. Christmas mail arrived from home. The Ardennes sector was handed to divisions like the 99th and 106th, units fresh from training, considered safe assignments. Engineers built wooden bridges over the Aar River, never suspecting that in 3 months those same bridges would become invasion routes. The Allied press described the front as static, a term not heard since 1940. But static lines breed static minds. As supply trains slowed, the tempo of belief slowed with them. By October, both sides had chosen their illusions. The Allies believed Germany could no longer surprise them. Hitler believed only surprise could save him. The result would be a convergence of overconfidence, one strategic, the other suicidal. Within 3 months, these illusions would collide in the snowbound forests of the Ardennes, unleashing the last great gamble of the Reich. The documents, the tonnage tables, the fuel charts, all pointed toward one truth Eisenhower sensed, but could not yet articulate. Wars are rarely won by the army that feels secure. They are won or lost by the army that still believes it has nothing left to lose. And on that cold autumn night in Versailles, Hitler's delusion was already shaping the storm that would come. October 11th, 1944, Adlerhorst headquarters, Taunus Mountains, Germany. A single kerosene lamp burned on the map table as Adolf Hitler leaned over a vast wall-sized chart of Western Europe, his trembling left hand tracing a red pencil line from the Eifel to Antwerp. Around him stood Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, and 2 commanders freshly summoned from the front, Gerd von Rundstedt and Walther Model. The room smelled of damp wool and tobacco smoke, heavy with the residue of countless night conferences. In that dim light, Hitler spoke of destiny, not logistics. One strike, he said, through the Ardennes. We cut the British from the Americans. We changed the war. His audience exchanged cautious glances. They had heard such words before, but on this night the order carried the ring of finality. The code name, handwritten in Hitler's own script, was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The plan demanded 30 divisions, roughly 250,000 men, supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns. Hitler insisted that the Sixth Panzer Army under SS General Josef Sepp Dietrich would spearhead the northern thrust, with Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army striking in the centre and Brandenberger's 7th Army shielding the southern flank. The operation required 400 trains to redeploy units in secret, each carrying up to 3,000 tons of material. To sustain the offensive for 10 days, the Wehrmacht calculated it would need over 15 million litres of fuel. General Hasso von Manteuffel protested, his tone more analytical than defiant. "My Führer, we lack the fuel for such a venture." Hitler dismissed the objection with a wave. "We will seize it from the Americans," he said. The words became an operational directive, not a boast. To Hitler, the Ardennes was not merely terrain, it was theatre. The thick forests and narrow roads recalled his memories of 1940, when his armies had pierced France through the same region in a lightning strike. Yet the conditions of 1944 were utterly different. Then Germany possessed air superiority, intact supply lines, and operational initiative. Now the Allies dominated the skies with over 12,000 aircraft, and the German army fought on starvation rations of ammunition and fuel. Where the British and American forces employed radio coordination, logistical convoys, and radar-controlled bombing, the Wehrmacht relied on couriers and deception. Still, Hitler clung to the illusion that surprise, his oldest weapon, could substitute for strength. He told Jodl that the enemy has become predictable. His confidence will blind him. That belief would anchor the coming disaster. At the operational level, the orders issued that October bore the hallmark of Hitler's micromanagement. He dictated not only objectives, but march timetables, bridge priorities, and even the sequence of road usage between divisions. OKW's planning papers, specifically Operations Bfehl No. 5, outlined the deployment of 30 divisions across a front no wider than 90 kilometers, a logistical compression unseen since Verdun. Intelligence blackout orders signed by Keitel forbade any telegraphic reference to Wacht am Rhein under penalty of court-martial. Communications were routed through couriers carrying sealed packets marked "Nur durch Offizier" by officer only. In practice, such secrecy slowed coordination to a crawl. Rundstedt's staff at Koblenz waited up to 72 hours for map corrections that Allied planners could transmit in minutes. Efficiency had been sacrificed to paranoia. Yet for Hitler, this operation transcended military calculus. Since the failed July 20th plot, he had retreated into a realm of fatalism. Convinced that Providence still guarded his mission, he told his adjutant, Major Nicholas von Below, that history remembers only those who dare everything. The Ardennes offensive was thus conceived not merely as strategy but as redemption, a final act to restore faith in his leadership. Reports from the Führer headquarters diary note his fixation with Antwerp, a port whose capture would sever Allied logistics feeding from Britain. In his mind, the geography itself symbolized reversal, a strike westward against the current of defeat. Yet the generals around him understood the reality. Model confided to his aide, "The plan has the glow of madness and the chill of inevitability." By late October, preparations expanded under an intricate web of deception. To disguise troop movements, the Wehrmacht revived dormant unit designations: Herbstnebel for diversionary actions, Greif for Otto Skorzeny's English-speaking commandos, and Stesser for airborne disruption behind enemy lines. Over 100,000 winter uniforms were requisitioned from depots in Magdeburg and Vienna, many unissued since the Eastern Front. The Americans, accustomed to static winter defense, noted no major German buildup in the Ardennes sector. Allied ultra-decrypts, focused on V-2 rocket traffic and Luftwaffe redeployments, missed the significance of encrypted logistics along the Rhine. Ironically, the same radio silence that paralyzed German coordination also shielded them from detection. What was chaos within appeared calm from without. Inside Adlerhorst, the tension grew almost liturgical. At midnight conferences, Hitler studied reconnaissance photos under magnifying glasses, tracing with his finger the ridgelines of the Schnee Eifel. His voice, weakened by Parkinsonian tremors, still carried the certainty of a prophet. Manteuffel later recalled, "He spoke as though destiny itself would provide our gasoline." In the same hours, Allied soldiers along the Belgian frontier brewed coffee in snow-covered foxholes, unaware that 30 divisions were assembling 50 kilometers away. For the German staff officers, obedience had become a refuge from doubt. They measured fuel allotments down to the liter, knowing the sums would never balance. Yet the order stood. History would judge obedience more harshly than error. By the first week of November, Wacht am Rhein had evolved into a massive contradiction, strategically desperate yet operationally elegant, reckless yet meticulously planned. Hitler saw in it the reflection of his own myth, a nation on the brink, summoning one last surge of will to defy annihilation. The final planning memorandum concluded with his handwritten note, "The hour of destiny approaches." Beneath the rhetoric lay arithmetic that no faith could alter: insufficient fuel, inadequate transport, and an exhausted army. Still, the machinery of secrecy and obedience moved forward. In that cold fortress above the Taunus, the dream of redemption hardened into an order of battle. The die had been cast, not by reason, but by the illusion of control. The Ardennes awaited its reckoning. November 10th, 1944, Eifel Mountains, Western Germany. A convoy of covered rail cars rolled silently into the freight yard at Euskirchen under blackout conditions. Each flat car carried a single tank, Panther, Tiger, or Jagdpanther, its turret wrapped in canvas, its engine drained of fuel to prevent accidental ignition. Military police from Feldgendarmerie Unit 428 sealed the train manifest under the code Nachtschäden, Nightshade. Between that night and the first week of December, over 1,400 trains would move divisions, artillery, and fuel barrels into the forested borderlands, always between dusk and dawn. The operation was choreographed with the precision of a stage illusion. The Eifel Mountains swallowed entire armies whole, concealing them beneath mist, pine, and silence. For the men of the Wehrmacht's Transport Command, this was not logistics, it was theater. The deception relied on three interlocking systems: movement, concealment, and silence. First, all rail schedules west of the Rhine were rewritten by the Reichsbahn Directorate in Cologne to prevent any pattern from appearing in Allied aerial photographs. Trains carrying Panzer IVs or self-propelled guns were broken into sections of 10 to 15 wagons to mimic civilian freight. Second, camouflage units of the Heeres Group B constructed false roofs of pine boughs and chicken wire across open clearings. These could disguise entire battalions from aerial view. Third and most crucial, Field Marshal Walter Model imposed total radio silence. Orders were hand-carried by couriers of the Funkabwehr, each bound by the Schweigeverpflichtung, the vow of silence. No wireless chatter, no traffic analysis, no pattern. The Germans had learned from the Eastern Front that silence itself could be louder than deception. Across the lines, Allied intelligence depended on sound, intercepts, transmissions, and signals. Bletchley Park's U-Ultra network, working from intercepted Enigma ciphers, had grown accustomed to a steady pulse of German radio. By autumn 1944, that pulse all but stopped in the Ardennes sector. To the analysts of Hut 6, the silence suggested exhaustion, not preparation. They reasoned that Army Group B, mauled after Operation Market Garden, was incapable of major action. The assumption was logical, but deadly. German radio silence inverted the Allied model of intelligence, where the Western Allies relied on communication as proof of life. The Germans weaponized its absence. In the calculus of signals, nothing had become everything. Operational deception extended beyond transmissions into the physical landscape itself. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, specifically Ju-88, DAT, and FDW-189 models, were grounded by direct order of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring to prevent Allied radar from detecting unusual activity over the Eifel. Civilian movement was frozen. Evacuation orders for frontier villages such as Prüm and Bitburg were rescinded, maintaining the illusion of calm. Entire panzer divisions bivouacked beneath pine canopies less than 10 kilometers from the front line. To further mask noise, engineers spread straw mats over roads and wrapped tank tracks in rubberized canvas. An American aerial reconnaissance report from the 19th Tactical Air Command dated December 6 recorded unusual forest density, but no armored concentrations. The deception was working, not through falsity, but through the absence of evidence. The German logistical staff, under General Alfred Jodel's oversight, faced arithmetic as complex as the deception itself. Moving 250,000 men required precise timing. Each regiment had to arrive in sequence without alerting Allied ground observers. According to OKW Operations File 1247, the average train carried 1,000 tons of supplies, including lubricants, rations, and ammunition. Fuel, always the limiting factor, was concentrated in secret depots near Euskirchen, May, and Darn, camouflaged as civilian dairy facilities. Comparatively, the Allies required nearly 3 times that tonnage per division due to their mechanized supply chain. German thrift was born of necessity, not efficiency, but in that necessity lay an unexpected advantage: less movement, less noise, less to detect. Meanwhile, psychological deception was conducted through Operation Herbstnebel, a deliberate misdirection implying that the German High Command planned to defend, not attack. Construction crews built dummy bunkers and trench lines along the Siegfried Line, visible to Allied reconnaissance. Propaganda broadcasts spoke of a winter stand, reinforcing the illusion of defensive fatigue. British field intelligence summaries, such as G2 Report No. 173, described enemy forces settling into static positions. The illusion was total. Even the 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley downgraded Ardennes surveillance, shifting its priority north toward the Rue. The Phantom Army was not invisible, it was hiding in plain sight. For the German officers executing this deception, the tension was unrelenting. Captain Friedrich von der Hayter, assigned to oversee supply coordination near Monchay, later wrote, "We lived between truth and silence. Each night, columns moved under blackout, headlights masked by slitted covers, allowing only a faint beam 6 meters ahead. Drivers counted distance by telegraph poles. A single breakdown could block an entire convoy for hours. And yet, discipline held. No unauthorized signal flares, no fires, no letters home." In a war increasingly marked by collapse, the Ardennes build-up represented the Wehrmacht's last demonstration of precision. It was a ghost army built from faith, fear, and calculation. By the second week of December, Army Group B had assembled 29 divisions within striking distance of the Meuse River without triggering Allied alarm. Bletchley Park remained puzzled by the radio void, issuing a memorandum on December 12th. German Western Command shows no operational pulse. That absence was the greatest deception of all. The Wehrmacht had become a shadow, an army that existed only in silence, trees, and darkness. For the first time since Normandy, the Allies were blind. The stage was set for the Ardennes to explode from stillness into violence. The Phantom Army was ready to step out of the forest, and when it did, the world would awaken too late. December 10th, 1944, St. Fifth Sector, Ardennes, Belgium. The morning fog hung low over the pine-studded ridges as the 106th Infantry Division unloaded trucks carrying rifles, mortars, and jeeps, taking over positions from the weary 28th Infantry Division. Soldiers hauled ammunition boxes along icy paths, while artillery crews emplaced 53mm and 81mm mortars in shallow foxholes. The front line stretched just 60 miles, a thin ribbon across dense forests that offered both concealment and vulnerability. Officers checked maps against compass bearings, measuring distances from the Sauer River to nearby crossroads with meticulous care. Each man was acutely aware that the Americans holding the Ardennes were largely green troops, fresh from training and lacking combat experience. In the pine scent of winter, a sense of normalcy settled, a calm before a storm that few could imagine. Technical preparation for the winter was rudimentary. Engineers inspected roads with widths of 3 to 5 meters, calculating load limits for Sherman tanks weighing 31 tons each. Mortar positions were camouflaged with local foliage, and machine gun emplacements were reinforced with timber from nearby logging operations. Weather reports from the U.S. First Army Meteorological Office predicted persistent low cloud cover, sleet, and sub-zero temperatures for the coming week, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. Communication lines relied on field telephones and runners, as radio sets like the SCR-300 backpack units had limited range through dense pine forests. Compared with German armored units prepared for a concentrated strike, the American engineering and logistical footprint was modest, exposing the Ardennes sector to operational surprise. These constraints would soon become lethal liabilities. American forces depended on mobility and artillery saturation to hold lines. Sherman tanks could reach a maximum speed of 25 km per hour on forest roads, and the 105mm howitzers had an effective range of 11 kilometers. In contrast, German Panzer IVs and Panthers, though heavier and slower, 15 to 20 km per hour over uneven terrain, were concentrated in massed formations, supported by 1,600 artillery pieces pre-registered along ridgelines. German logistics emphasized surprise, while American doctrine relied on dispersed defensive positions and predictable resupply schedules. The contrast between quantity and distribution, coupled with terrain advantage, favored the attacker despite technological parity in small arms and armor. The Ardennes had become a natural trap. Field evidence of this vulnerability emerged in December. Reconnaissance patrols recorded faint impressions of tank tracks in frozen soil north of Malmedy, yet these were dismissed as minor training movements. Observation posts along the Rosa and our rivers reported unusual truck convoys at night, with headlights masked and engines throttled, but commanders filed these as routine German resupply. Even the 106th Infantry's own intelligence reports noted increased Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, which often penetrated cloud cover for 10 to 15 minutes before disappearing. The signs, scattered and inconclusive, were drowned in routine data demonstrating how cognitive biases can blind forces to concentrated enemy preparations. When read collectively, these observations presaged a massive offensive. Broader implications for the US First Army were becoming apparent in planning documents. A memorandum dated December 11, 1944, highlighted that less than 50% of frontline positions were fortified with concrete or steel obstacles. Barbed wire coverage averaged 100 meters per sector, insufficient to delay mechanized columns. Sherman and M4A3 tanks were positioned in small, dispersed groups, unable to provide overlapping fields of fire. Comparatively, German planning documents from OKW specified columns spaced to maintain rapid advance while covering flanks with artillery, a level of integration the Americans lacked. The front's thin defense and the approaching winter conditions created the perfect convergence for operational shock. Additional evidence came from the soldiers themselves. Letters from Private James O'Connell of the 106th Infantry described decorating pine trees for Christmas with ration tinsel and candy, noting that the forest feels strangely silent. Sergeant Thomas Beck observed that supply routes were muddy and limited to single-lane tracks, slowing reinforcement. Officers performed map drills tracing German advances, but the mental exercise failed to translate into real threat anticipation. Observers recorded that Allied radar stations detected minimal armored activity, reinforcing the belief that the Ardennes sector was quiet. German emphasis on secrecy and camouflage had transformed the forest into a deceptive landscape, invisible until impact. Operational consequences of these conditions were profound. Troops were thinly spread along ridge lines and villages, lacking overlapping fields of fire. Artillery could only support a fraction of the front due to line-of-sight limitations in dense forest. The lack of winterized equipment slowed troop movements and resupply, leaving sections vulnerable to surprise penetration. Communication delays meant that reports from forward units could take hours to reach divisional command, further limiting the ability to react. Combined, these factors created a systemic weakness invisible to the soldiers within it, a perilous calm that invited disaster. By December 15th, the Ardennes sector appeared deceptively peaceful. Low clouds hung over the ridges, sleet fell intermittently, and the 106th Infantry completed its final inspections. In the silence, men joked about the early arrival of winter, unaware that German divisions were already in position along the Schnee Eifel and Losheim Gap. Meteorological forecasts predicted continued fog and cloud cover, ideal conditions for surprise attacks. Confidence, a product of misreading German movements, had become blindness. The quiet was not calm, it was the tension before an avalanche. When the assault began, the forest would erupt, and the Green divisions would face the full weight of Hitler's gamble. December 16th, 1944, Schnee Eifel, Belgium. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, over 1,600 German artillery pieces erupted along a 60-mile front, sending shock waves across pine-strewn ridges and frozen roads. Shells from 150mm and 210mm howitzers tore into foxholes and supply dumps, obliterating communications lines and cutting field telephones in half. From the forests near Losheim, Kampfgruppe Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division rumbled forward, its tigers and panthers coated in mud and ice, headlights masked by rubber flaps. The first volleys were coordinated with devastating precision, demonstrating the German ability to synchronize artillery, armor, and infantry. US forward observers scrambled, their maps useless as shellfire tore familiar terrain into chaos. The 106th Infantry Division, inexperienced and thinly spread, struggled to maintain cohesion under the sudden onslaught. Within minutes, what had been a quiet, frozen forest became a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and screaming engines. The Germans achieved this initial shock through meticulous technical preparation. Each artillery battery had pre-registered firing coordinates across 32 sectors, calculated to maximize coverage of road junctions, bridges, and defensive strongpoints. Tanks and self-propelled guns moved in precise columns, spaced 400 meters apart, to minimize vulnerability to American counterfire. Supply trains had been staged within 10 kilometers of the front under cover of darkness, allowing panzer units to operate at a maximum range of 50 kilometers from refueling points. Radio silence maintained by the Funkabwehr ensured that no signal intercepted by Allied direction-finding stations could compromise the attack. Compared with US artillery, which relied on reactive fire plans with limited pre-registration, the German methodology favored speed, surprise, and massed effect. The practical consequence was instantaneous battlefield domination. American forces were at a severe disadvantage in both numbers and deployment. The 106th Infantry fielded only 16 battalions across the Schnee Eifel, totaling roughly 8,300 men in contact zones, supported by 22 M4A, 3 Sherman tanks, and 3,100 5mm howitzers. German divisions attacking comprised approximately 200,000 men, with concentrated armor from the 1st SS Panzer, 2nd Panzer, and 116th Panzer divisions. Where American positions were dispersed to cover thin lines, German doctrine emphasized penetration points, rapid encirclement, and artillery suppression. Communication delays compounded the problem. Reports from forward positions could take up to 3 hours to reach regimental headquarters. In the opening hours, the imbalance in strategy, concentration, and initiative became brutally evident. Field reports confirmed the immediate results of the German breakthrough. At Honsfeld, Peiper's armored Spearhead captured over 200 prisoners and destroyed 4 roadblocks in under 90 minutes. Mortar crews of the 106th Infantry Division reported 75% casualties within the first 3 hours, as heavy shell fire rendered defensive positions ineffective. Observation posts noted the German armor moving 60 kilometers deep into the Ardennes within 48 hours, a tempo the Americans had not anticipated. Forward medics recorded the logistical collapse of first aid stations, where cold, wounded soldiers could not be evacuated due to shell-cratered roads. Even small units attempting to regroup were consistently targeted by reconnaissance aircraft and artillery fire, demonstrating the lethal integration of German combined arms. The broader implications of this initial strike were rapidly becoming clear to US command. Communication breakdowns meant that the First Army could not coordinate a concentrated counterattack. Supply lines, already limited by forest roads 3 to 5 meters wide, were quickly disrupted, preventing timely delivery of ammunition and rations. Radar and reconnaissance reported minimal German air activity due to persistent cloud cover, masking armored movements, while the artillery assault weakened the front. Compared with the German ability to move and concentrate firepower, US forces relied on static defense, with dispersed reinforcements, creating a vulnerability that could be exploited across the entire 60-mile sector. Reports from December 17th emphasized that initial gains could soon translate into deep strategic penetration if unimpeded. Additional evidence of operational superiority came from German after-action notes captured later in Kriegstagebuch OKW entries. Kampfgruppe Peiper's orders emphasized rapid junction with the 2nd Panzer Division to secure critical roadways towards Stavelot and Tros-Ponts, aiming to split American forces in half. Artillery coordinates were adjusted in real time using forward observers on bicycles and on foot, allowing corrections of fire in under 10 minutes. In contrast, American artillery units relied on pre-planned grid coordinates and lacked mobility in the dense forest. Even where M4 Shermans attempted counterattacks, they were slowed by narrow roads, mines, and shell craters, demonstrating the tactical advantage of German planning, terrain exploitation, and concentrated force application. The human consequences of the December 16th breakthrough were immediate and severe. Soldiers of the 106th Infantry, including Company A of the 422nd Regiment, reported panic, disorganization, and loss of morale as German tanks rolled past their positions. Field hospital reports indicate over 1,000 casualties within the first 24 hours, including frostbite exacerbated by lack of winterized supplies. Convoys attempting to retreat faced ambushes, communications breakdowns left units isolated. Private accounts describe men abandoning equipment in dense forests while attempting to link up with neighboring units. By evening, entire battalions had dissolved into small groups, unable to form coherent defense lines. The initial shock of German coordination had inflicted not only physical losses, but organizational paralysis. By the close of December 16th, the Ardennes was transformed into a tableau of chaos. German armored columns had advanced 60 kilometers. Artillery had devastated defensive positions, and the inexperienced American troops faced a crisis of command and cohesion. The operational momentum rested squarely with the attacker, while the defenders scrambled to regroup amidst destroyed roads and obscured communications. Reports reaching Shashaf indicated that the Germans had achieved a depth of penetration unseen since Normandy, catching Allied command completely off guard. The forest that had seemed so quiet only 24 hours prior had erupted into infernal violence. The question now hung over every American officer and soldier: could they recover fast enough to prevent total collapse, or would the German avalanche continue unopposed into the heart of the Ardennes? December 17th, 1944. Setschaf Headquarters, Versailles, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat rigidly in front of the map table as his aides delivered fragmented reports of German breakthroughs along the Ardennes front. Telephone lines crackled and failed intermittently, cutting off communication with General Omar N. Bradley's First Army in Luxembourg for nearly 2 hours. Staff officers laid out position markers, showing Peiper's First SS Panzer Division advancing toward Losheim and Stavelot, while Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army pushed deeper than any Allied forecast. Outside, overcast skies and persistent fog grounded reconnaissance aircraft, depriving Setschaf of vital aerial confirmation. Eisenhower's notepads filled with penciled annotations, often overwritten in frustration, as he questioned whether the counterattack could reach Antwerp or was merely a feint. The air hung heavy with tension. Radio operators in Brussels struggled to patch together intermittent messages from isolated units. Every minute of delay risked turning temporary confusion into systemic collapse. The Allied paralysis was compounded by technical and logistical vulnerabilities. Road networks in the Ardennes, consisting of narrow snow-covered lanes 3 to 4 meters wide, became choke points as retreating units and supply convoys collided. Weather reports confirmed that fog and low cloud ceilings would ground the 8th Air Force for at least 5 consecutive days, nullifying the air superiority that had defined Allied operations since Normandy. Mechanized units were restricted to speeds of 15 km per hour due to icy surfaces and congestion, while artillery batteries could not reposition without blocking critical junctions. In comparison, German units benefited from pre-planned infiltration routes, camouflage nets, and night movement schedules, allowing tanks to maintain average speeds of 25 km per hour, even in adverse conditions. Operation Reich, in which German soldiers donned US uniforms to sow confusion, further disrupted movement and identification protocols. The combination of terrain, weather, and deception created an operational fog that few could penetrate. When juxtaposed against German planning, Allied command appeared dangerously reactive. US divisions relied on linear defensive doctrine, assuming an orderly retreat and predictable reinforcement schedules. By contrast, German doctrine emphasized flexibility, speed, and exploiting gaps in the enemy's intelligence. Whereas the Americans concentrated on holding fixed sectors, the Germans shifted armored columns through forested passes to bypass strong points entirely. Communication protocols differed sharply. American forces transmitted updates through telephones and radios susceptible to disruption, while German units implemented messenger runners, visual signals, and pre-arranged fallback routes. The practical consequence was that by mid-morning, German spearheads had bypassed multiple defensive positions before the Americans could mount coherent resistance. Field evidence of Allied disarray quickly mounted. The 28th Infantry Division established a tenuous stand at Wiltz, repelling a brief assault but suffering over 50% casualties in the first 12 hours. Forward reports indicated several isolated outposts were surrounded, forcing small groups to surrender or fight in fragmented pockets. Roadblocks intended to slow the advance were overrun, with units abandoning vehicles and ammunition in the snow. Air liaison officers documented multiple misidentifications of German convoys as friendly columns, delaying artillery support by hours. Journal entries from 2nd Lieutenant John R. Malone describe repeated false alarms, conflicting orders, and exhaustion among enlisted men, highlighting how operational confusion translated directly into battlefield vulnerability. The broader implications for Allied command were alarming. If the line in Luxembourg and southern Belgium continued to fracture, the German advance could threaten Bastogne and potentially disrupt the entire supply chain supporting the 1st and 9th Armies. Meteorological data suggested continued low visibility for several days, ensuring that armored columns could maintain momentum unchallenged by airstrikes. Intelligence estimates were incomplete. Ultra-intercepts captured intermittent German communications, but failed to clarify objectives or unit positions. Compared with German planning, Allied assessments were slower, reactive, and fragmented, amplifying the effectiveness of the initial offensive. Commanders were forced to consider contingency plans they had previously relegated to theoretical exercises. Further supporting evidence of Allied vulnerability came from logistical audits and after-action reports. Fuel depots at Bastogne were calculated to last for only 72 hours under sustained combat conditions. Bridges along the Aar River were at 50% structural capacity, with reconnaissance noting increased load stress from traffic jams. The collapse of telephone exchanges in Dierkirch and Echternach forced reliance on motorcycle messengers and runners, who faced exposure to artillery fire and German infiltration units. In contrast, German engineers maintained bridge reinforcements and cleared secondary routes in advance, allowing armored units to bypass obstacles that would have immobilized US tanks. Combined, these operational factors magnified the perception of chaos within Allied headquarters. Human consequences were immediately visible at the front. Soldiers reported chronic fatigue, stress-induced confusion, and miscommunication, leading to friendly fire incidents. Commanders at regimental and battalion levels struggled to coordinate artillery, armor and infantry, often relying on handwritten notes and courier updates. Reports from Wiltz describe men sleeping in snow-filled foxholes while maintaining watch, improvising defensive perimeters with minimal ammunition. Civilians in towns along the advance face sudden evacuations under threat of bombardment, adding to logistical congestion and increasing vulnerability. For every successful stand, multiple positions were abandoned without organized withdrawal, illustrating the direct link between command confusion and frontline attrition. By the close of December 17th, the fog of war had thickened both literally and metaphorically over the Ardennes. German units exploited every advantage, moving with deceptive precision, while Allied command struggled to reconcile fragmentary intelligence, disrupted communications, and immobilized air assets. The 28th Division's resistance at Wiltz offered a temporary anchor, but higher command feared the advance could cascade into a broader collapse. Questions loomed over Sèvres. Could order be restored before Bastogne became encircled, and was the ultimate German objective Antwerp, or simply to sever the Allied front? Every hour that passed without clarity heightened the stakes, as commanders balanced reactive measures with desperate contingency planning. The stage was set for the coming confrontation in Bastogne, where the Allies' resilience would be tested against both the enemy and their own organizational disarray. December 19th, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Columns of the 101st Airborne Division rattled over snow-packed roads, jeeps and trucks, bearing the serial numbers 4D11234 and 4D11356, struggling to navigate the icy approaches under Lieutenant General Anthony C. McAuliffe's orders. Belgian civilians huddled in damp cellars as distant thunder from German artillery shells shook window panes and sent shutters rattling. Telephone lines crackled intermittently, forcing couriers to traverse frozen streets between headquarters and defensive outposts. McAuliffe scanned the map of 7 vital crossroads, knowing that every road controlled by his forces was a hinge for the entire Ardennes front. Snow fell in sheets, reducing visibility to under 50 meters and grounding the few reconnaissance aircraft available. Forward units radioed that German armored columns had already penetrated positions near Neuville, adding urgency to the airborne rush. The town held the hopes of both beleaguered defenders and anxious ASAF planners. Technical assessments of Bastogne's defenses revealed a fragile improvisational network. 18,000 American troops were spread thinly around the perimeter, reinforced by only 24 75mm Pack howitzers and 12 M4 Sherman tanks in operational condition. Defensive positions consisted of hastily dug foxholes and converted municipal buildings, often separated by several hundred meters with no continuous trench lines. German intelligence estimated that 45,000 men, including elements of the 2nd Panzer and 1st SS Panzer divisions, would encircle the town within 24 hours. Airdrop supplies were anticipated, but could not arrive until December 23rd due to cloud cover and fog, leaving units dependent on rationed ammunition, medical supplies, and cold weather gear. Compared with German forces, American anti-tank capabilities were rudimentary. Panzerfaust and bazooka teams could engage at a maximum of 35 meters effectively, whereas German 75mm Pack 42 guns had ranges exceeding 1,200 meters. The practical consequence was that defenders would need to rely on terrain, improvisation, and rapid unit coordination to survive the initial assaults. The operational contrast between German and American approaches was stark. Germans employed concentrated armored thrusts, rapid flanking maneuvers, and combined arms tactics designed to exploit weak points. By comparison, American defense doctrine emphasized perimeter security and delaying actions while awaiting reinforcements. German units maintained strict radio discipline, minimized electronic signatures, and camouflaged vehicle movements beneath snow-covered pine branches, while American units were partially reliant on exposed telegraph lines and intermittent radio communications. Operation Reich, German soldiers disguised as American troops, further eroded the defenders' situational awareness. The consequence of this asymmetry was immediate initial German probes forced multiple American units to withdraw or risk encirclement before the full perimeter could be established. Field reports and after-action accounts confirmed the intensity of combat within the first 48 hours. Artillery fire from the 116th Panzer and 5th Parachute Regiments struck repeatedly, with several shells measured at 75 kilograms impacting near the town square, reducing masonry structures to rubble. Sniper activity and small unit infiltrations prevented the consolidation of defensive positions. Lieutenant James R. Hockaday of Battery B recorded that the 50mm anti-tank guns successfully disabled 2 Panther tanks at ranges of 120 meters, buying critical time for infantry units to reposition. Civilians were forced to vacate damaged homes and congregate in basements, creating a complex humanitarian overlay atop the tactical situation. Communications with higher command remained sporadic, complicating coordination for artillery resupply and medical evacuation. The broader implications became increasingly evident as McAuliffe issued orders to consolidate defenses along the most critical crossroads. Losing control of any of the 7 arterial roads would allow German columns to sever supply and reinforcement routes, jeopardizing the entire 1st and 9th Army front. Meteorological predictions indicated continued snow and sleet, further delaying anticipated airdrops of rations and ammunition. Comparisons with German planning revealed that Bastogne's defenders were now a pivot point. Their success or failure would influence operational tempo across the Ardennes sector. Commanders understood that failure at Bastogne would have strategic consequences far beyond a single town, threatening to destabilize the Allied advance into Germany. Supporting evidence of the town's significance was visible in detailed logistical and intelligence assessments. German reconnaissance photographs, captured and analyzed by US intelligence, highlighted the concentration of units near critical intersections. Fuel shortages for mechanized German columns, however, imposed operational limits, which the Allies noted in intercepted communications. Defensive calculations demonstrated that even with inferior firepower, the defenders could leverage narrow streets, elevated positions, and interior lines to delay and attrit the attackers. Post-war analysis of McAuliffe's decisions confirms that prioritizing these points allowed the airborne troops to hold effectively until Patton's Third Army approached. The combination of terrain exploitation, unit cohesion, and resource management created a defensive paradox, small forces holding out against overwhelming numbers. The human dimension of Bastogne's defense was striking. Soldiers endured sub-zero temperatures, rationing and near constant shell fire, while maintaining watch over critical crossroads. McAuliffe's famously laconic response of "nuts" to a German surrender demand encapsulated morale and defiance, signaling to troops that surrender was not an option. Belgian civilians navigated bombed streets to provide food, medical care, and information about German movements. Letters and diary entries from paratroopers describe frostbite, exhaustion, and improvisation under fire, emphasizing how leadership and resilience directly influence survivability. The human cost was immense, yet the determination of defenders created a psychological bulwark against German expectations of a rapid capitulation. By December 20th, Bastogne had solidified as both a tactical and symbolic linchpin of the Ardennes front. 18,000 American defenders, constrained by cold, limited artillery and encirclement, had successfully delayed 45,000 German troops. The crossroads remained contested but operational, sustaining the logistical backbone for the entire sector. Questions persisted over how long the town could endure without resupply, and whether the impending arrival of Patton's Third Army would arrive in time to exploit the stabilized perimeter. Bastogne became a testament to improvisation, tenacity, and the interplay of human and operational factors in modern warfare. The defense demonstrated that even under overwhelming odds, terrain, planning, and morale could blunt what appeared to be an unstoppable advance, setting the stage for the eventual counteroffensive that would shift the momentum in the Ardennes. December 17th, 1944, Stavelot, Belgium. The lead tanks of Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division rumbled over the snow-laden cobblestones, their Tiger IIs and Panthers bearing serial numbers 250061, 250112, and 250198, exhaust plumes curling against a grey sky. German orders from the 6th SS Panzer Army demanded no delay, emphasizing speed over caution. Villagers scattered across frozen fields and riverbanks, abandoning carts laden with potatoes and firewood, while artillery bursts from 150mm howitzers echoed over the Ardennes hills. Peiper's columns, intended to seize the L'Arglise, Stoumont corridor, were already slowed by fuel shortages. Each panzer needed roughly 480 litres of high-octane fuel per 100 kilometres, and supply trucks struggled along icy secondary roads. Reconnaissance vehicles scanned for American positions, while SS infantry swept the edges of forests to prevent ambushes. Propaganda units simultaneously documented progress, exaggerating the pace to Berlin by claiming advances of 35 kilometers in 12 hours. The air was tense, charged with both military purpose and ideological fervor as the column pressed toward Malmedy. Technical reports from Peiper's staff highlighted logistical vulnerabilities that undercut operational efficiency. Fuel shortages meant that 2 of the 17 Tiger IIs in the Spearhead stalled within the first 20 kilometers, forcing recovery teams to divert manpower and delay armored thrusts. Maintenance logs noted that tracks on the Panther Ulspert G weighed nearly 45 tons and required daily lubrication, especially in sub-zero temperatures, to prevent crippling fractures. Ammunition consumption was already critical. The 75mm KWK-42 guns mounted on Panthers burned through an average of 72 rounds per vehicle during the first engagements, leaving units dependent on precarious resupply lines. Radio discipline prevented routine updates, with messages sent in coded Morse bursts every 90 minutes, meaning units occasionally advanced without clear knowledge of nearby American positions. Compared with US armor, which emphasized modular resupply and distributed fuel caches, the Waffen-SS approach demanded continuous operational momentum at the risk of mechanical breakdown. The contrast between German offensive doctrine and American defensive preparations became visible along the Malmedy corridor. Peiper's men exploited combined arms, integrating armor, mechanized infantry, and mobile artillery to punch through the sparse American defenses. 28th Infantry Division relied on static roadblocks, hastily constructed foxholes, and limited anti-tank weapons, often M1 bazookas, with maximum effective ranges of 35 meters versus German 75mm pack, 42 guns capable of disabling armor at 1200 meters. Camouflage and deception allowed German columns to move undetected past secondary observation posts, while US forces frequently misidentified friendly vehicles due to confusion over snow-covered markings. These disparities produced an operational gap, enabling Peiper's advance to penetrate American lines with fewer casualties than might have been expected under conventional circumstances. Field reports from survivors of the Malmedy massacre provide grim confirmation of the Seventh SS's ideological zeal. On December 17th, 84 American prisoners, primarily from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, were executed near the Bulge crossroads. Eyewitness accounts describe machine gun fire delivered in bursts, followed by hand grenades tossed among the survivors. Physical evidence recorded by post-war investigations, including a 1946 U.S. Army report titled Investigation of Malmedy Massacre, confirmed shell casings from MG-45 submachine guns and 9mm parabellum rounds, corroborating accounts from both German deserters and civilian witnesses. The deliberate targeting of unarmed personnel demonstrated a departure from conventional battlefield objectives and an adherence to a punitive ideological logic embedded in SS doctrine. The broader operational consequences were immediate and multifaceted. German troops advancing along the Stavelot-Malmedy corridor slowed as civilian flight, and destroyed infrastructure created bottlenecks, particularly along the frozen Amblève River. Fuel shortages compounded the delays, as each mechanized vehicle consumed hundreds of liters for every 25 kilometers, forcing Peiper to prioritize tanks over infantry transport. Despite initial gains, the SS Spearhead risked overextension, and the brutal treatment of prisoners galvanized Allied forces psychologically, increasing defensive resolve in surrounding sectors. Comparisons with US conduct highlighted the contrast between operational pragmatism and ideologically driven violence, raising urgent questions among American commanders about how to respond effectively to this combination of military skill and criminal ruthlessness. Additional supporting evidence emerges from the interplay of intelligence and reconnaissance. Reports from US aerial reconnaissance, limited by low cloud cover and sleet, were delayed, leaving units unaware of the exact position of Peiper's columns until civilians provided first-hand accounts. Intercepted communications revealed that German propaganda exaggerated progress by over 15 kilometers per day in reports sent to Berlin, intending to maintain morale among home front audiences. Supply manifests indicate that fuel depots, normally supporting 47 vehicles per day, were depleted within 36 hours, forcing improvisation and rationing. Even minor mechanical failures caused cascading delays, highlighting how operational success depended as much on discipline and improvisation as on firepower. Human consequences of the assault were profound. Survivors of the Malmedy execution faced psychological trauma, recounting the horrors in letters and debriefings that described the systematic execution of wounded and unarmed men. Belgian civilians, fleeing across icy rivers to escape both artillery and SS patrols, suffered frostbite and exposure, carrying children and small livestock in makeshift sleds. Soldiers of Peiper's column faced the tension of operational pressure and moral compromise, as some refused orders while others followed directives to maintain unit cohesion. The combination of fear, obedience, and ideology produced a complex moral landscape with consequences for conduct, accountability, and morale on both sides of the front. By the close of December 17th, Peiper's advance had achieved tactical penetration, but at a heavy moral and operational cost. Fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and staunch American defensive resistance slowed progress to 12 kilometers per day, far below projected estimates. The Malmedy massacre transformed the conflict into one that was as much about moral outrage as military maneuver, strengthening Allied resolve to resist and counterattack. Civilians and soldiers alike recognized that the assault was both a military gamble and an ideological expression, revealing the core brutality of the Waffen SS. These events foreshadowed the strategic and ethical pressures that would shape the Ardennes campaign, demonstrating that operational gains could be undermined by overreach, resource limitations, and the psychological repercussions of deliberate atrocities. December 20th, 1944, L'Église, Belgium. A line of abandoned Panther tanks, Ors G serial numbers 250121, 250144, and 250179, sat immobilized along snow-covered roads, their engines cold and turret hatches frozen shut. Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Spearhead ground to a halt. Immobilized not by enemy fire but by a lack of fuel, column reports indicated that only 50% of supply trucks had reached forward positions, and each Panther, weighing 45 tons and averaging 1 mile per gallon, required nearly 400 liters for every operational advance of 30 kilometers. Partisan ambushes along secondary roads destroyed an additional 12 fuel trucks, and weather conditions with sleet and dense fog delayed resupply convoys by 24 hours. Ultra intercepts from Bletchley Park already reflected growing German desperation, revealing encoded messages pleading for emergency fuel allocations. Soldiers, aware of the vulnerability, removed ammunition and personal equipment to lighten vehicles in hopes of extending mobility. The once feared Spearhead now resembled a line of inert steel, its offensive potential evaporating in frozen silence. Technical assessments of Wehrmacht fuel logistics underscored systemic vulnerabilities. Pre-operation planning had projected fuel consumption at 20 million litres for the Ardennes offensive, yet by December 20th, units were 12 million litres short. Each 500 kilogram Panther consumed roughly 100 litres per 10 kilometers of cross-country advance, and half-tracks such as the SD.KFZ 251 required 60 litres per 30 kilometers, creating a cascading shortage. Supply trucks, mostly Opel Blitz 3-ton vehicles, travelled at a maximum of 25 kilometers per hour on icy roads, and disruptions caused by ambushes or mechanical failures amplified delays exponentially. Allied planners contrasted this with American logistics, where modular supply points and pre-positioned reserves allowed armored columns to advance without interruption. For Peiper, the immediate consequence was operational stagnation, forcing a reallocation of resources and a retrenchment of Spearhead objectives. Comparative analysis between German and American operational flexibility became starkly evident along the L'Église corridor. While Wehrmacht vehicles were constrained by linear fuel lines stretching 50 to 60 kilometers from depots near Spa and Stavelot, U.S. forces relied on decentralized fuel caches along secondary roads, enabling rapid redeployment. Panther and Tiger tanks, with 1 mile per gallon efficiency under winter conditions, consumed nearly 3 times the fuel of American Men 4A3 Shermans, which could average 3 miles per gallon on the same terrain. German units also lacked contingency for prolonged immobilization, whereas U.S. armored units adapted to road congestion by rotating fuel stocks and conducting nighttime deliveries. The operational implication was clear. Despite superior armor and firepower, German units were tethered to fragile logistical lifelines that American planners could exploit. Field evidence confirmed these vulnerabilities. Peiper ordered several Panther tanks abandoned near L'Église, while C.KFC 251 half-tracks were left with only partial fuel loads. Reconnaissance notes documented that 15% of forward vehicles were non-operational due to fuel depletion alone, forcing infantry units to march alongside immobilized armor. Reports from captured SS supply officers, later included in German Ardennes logistical reports, indicate that attempts to capture Allied fuel depots largely failed. Strikes on the dumps near Bastogne were miscalculated, leaving the Wehrmacht still reliant on distant supply lines. The cumulative effect reduced the Spearhead's average advance to less than 5 kilometers per day, far below projected gains of 15 to 20 kilometers. The strategic implications of fuel scarcity became immediately visible. With Peiper immobilized, flanking units lost momentum, creating gaps that American forces could exploit for counterattacks. Snow and fog continued to ground Allied air power, preventing reconnaissance from fully confirming German weakness. Yet ultra-intercepts provided insight that German columns were faltering. Delays forced a re-evaluation of objectives. The capture of Bastogne within 48 hours became increasingly unlikely. The reliance on linear fuel lines meant that even minor disruptions such as destroyed convoys or iced-over roads could halt an entire corps, illustrating the operational fragility behind the German advance. Additional supporting evidence emerged from German internal communications. Peiper's divisional staff sent urgent cables to Sixth SS Panzer Army headquarters, noting fuel consumption rates exceeding 400 liters per panther per day, and the immediate need for mobile refueling units. Ambushes by Belgian partisans destroyed 12 Opel Blitz trucks, reducing daily delivery capacity by 25%. Propaganda reports sent to Berlin continued to exaggerate gains, claiming advances of 20 kilometers per day, while operationally, units had stalled entirely for periods of up to 36 hours. The discrepancy between reported progress and field reality highlighted both command desperation and logistical failure. Human consequences of the fuel crisis were acute. Panzer crews stranded in sub-zero temperatures dismantled vehicle components to conserve fuel and extend operational reach, while infantry accompanying immobilized armor suffered frostbite and exhaustion after extended marches in deep snow. Soldiers reported morale decline as the perceived invincibility of the Spearhead vanished, with diaries noting frustration at being forced to abandon functioning vehicles. Commanders, unable to maneuver due to fuel shortages, faced impossible decisions about whether to risk exposure for refueling or remain in place, compounding the psychological stress and undermining cohesion. By the evening of December 20th, the Ardennes offensive's fate had shifted decisively. Peiper's immobilized column symbolized the operational limits imposed by fuel scarcity, weather, and partisan interference. The initial terror of the Spearhead gave way to stagnation, enabling Allied forces to consolidate positions and prepare countermeasures. Ultra-intelligence confirmed that German units had consumed nearly 70% of their forward fuel stock without achieving decisive breakthroughs, signaling the approaching turning point. The German gamble, reliant on steel and speed, was now constrained by liters of fuel, demonstrating that operational audacity could not overcome logistical reality. Air support awaited the first break in cloud cover, ready to exploit immobilized vehicles, turning a tactical initiative into a strategic vulnerability. December 23, 1944, Hurled, Belgium. The first rays of sunlight broke through the dense cloud cover, illuminating a forested valley where German columns stretched for over 10 kilometers, their Panzer IVs and Panther tanks glinting metallically in the winter light. Allied reconnaissance pilots reported over 1,000 aircraft ready for takeoff, including P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, their full bomb and ammunition loads prepared for immediate deployment. Ground observers in Bastogne watched plumes of black smoke rising from abandoned vehicles as strafing runs began. The sudden clarity revealed the precise locations of SS Panzer units, whose fuel shortages had already immobilized nearly 70% of forward vehicles. Air support, previously grounded for 5 days due to fog and snow, now allowed coordination with ground signals, enabling paratroopers to receive supplies at designated drop zones. The combination of sunlight and aviation power ended the illusion of German surprise, exposing the Spearhead's fragility. Technical details of air interdiction revealed the decisive role of speed and firepower. Each P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs and 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, capable of achieving up to 400 rounds per minute, sufficient to disable armored vehicles from a safe altitude of 500 meters. Reconnaissance photographs confirmed destruction of over 700 German vehicles, including Panzer IV serial numbers 72043 and 72111, within 48 hours of air operations. Bombing accuracy was aided by forward observers using smoke markers to designate high-priority targets, a system superior to German attempts at camouflage or deceptive column movements. Allied intelligence analysts cross-referenced ultra-intercepts and aerial photos, documenting both loss rates and the positions of immobilized fuel trucks, creating a feedback loop that maximized operational efficiency. Comparisons between German and Allied air-ground integration highlighted stark differences in doctrine. The Luftwaffe, despite Operation Bodenplatte on January 1st, suffered from fragmented planning and low operational readiness, with less than 40% of deployed aircraft achieving mission success. German forces relied on improvised observation posts and ground-based spotters, leaving them reactive rather than proactive. In contrast, the U.S. 9th Air Force synchronized airstrikes with paratroop resupply drops, using radio beacons and prearranged signals to guide aircraft to designated zones. This coordination allowed a continuous feedback loop that corrected targeting errors within hours, a level of integration that Peiper's Spearhead could not counter. Operational consequences were immediate stalled German advances and increased vulnerability of armored formations to repeated airstrikes. Field evidence confirmed the effectiveness of Allied air operations. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division received concentrated resupply drops over Bastogne, including 500 rations and 2,000 artillery shells, restoring critical combat capability. Observers recorded strafing runs along the Hoffelise corridor, where P-47 says destroyed 15 Panther tanks and 24 Panzer IVs over a 6-hour period. Photographic confirmation from reconnaissance aircraft documented extensive vehicle losses, corroborating reports from the front lines. The combination of air power and logistical support prevented German units from advancing beyond previously captured positions, marking the first time in 5 days that American forces regained operational initiative. The broader implications became apparent as intelligence officers analyzed the operational tempo. German columns immobilized by fuel shortages now faced concentrated aerial bombardment, compounding attrition. Ultra-intercepts revealed growing frustration among Sixth SS Panzer Army Command, with messages highlighting repeated requests for fuel and reinforcements that were unfulfilled. The cumulative effect signaled a turning point in the Ardennes, transforming the initial German tactical advantage into a strategic vulnerability. Planners recognized that continued daylight operations, now possible after prolonged poor weather, would decisively blunt the offensive within days. Additional evidence underscored the comprehensive impact of air power. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units failed to locate Allied aircraft assembly points, and attempts at counterstrikes through Operation Bodenplatte resulted in the loss of 36 aircraft on the ground and another 21 in air combat, leaving German air superiority negligible. Comparisons with the coordinated US 9th and 8th Air Forces, which combined high-altitude bombing with tactical strafing runs, highlighted systemic German weaknesses in rapid response and logistics. Reports from Bastogne documented destroyed supply vehicles, immobilized tanks, and exposed fuel depots, demonstrating that the combined arms approach of the Allies exploited multiple German vulnerabilities simultaneously. Human consequences were immediate and dramatic. Paratroopers, previously confined to dwindling supplies, now received desperately needed rations, ammunition, and winter clothing, sustaining morale and combat readiness. German tank crews abandoned vehicles in frozen fields, often leaving behind operational weapons and personal gear to conserve remaining fuel. Civilians in Bastogne, who had endured continuous artillery barrages, witnessed a temporary cessation of frontline pressure, allowing evacuation and medical attention for the wounded. Frontline soldiers wrote letters and field diaries noting the sudden shift in fortune, emphasizing the psychological as well as material relief brought by air operations. By the close of December 23rd, the Ardennes Offensive faced an irreversible turning point. Allied air power had destroyed over 700 vehicles, provided resupply to encircled units, and exposed German positions to continuous observation. The German Spearhead, reliant on stalled fuel lines and immobilized armor, could no longer advance without catastrophic risk. Commanders recognized that the tactical advantage gained in early December was now eroded, setting the stage for Patton's Third Army to exploit weaknesses. The sun had literally and figuratively broken the German advance, ending surprise, exposing vulnerability, and marking the beginning of the offensive's collapse. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively, and the momentum of Hitler's gamble faltered under the combined force of steel, sky, and human coordination. December 19, 1944. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. Patton leaned over a large map table, tracing the Ardennes corridor with a sharpened pencil, while his staff calculated distances and fuel consumption for a 90-degree pivot of 3 full divisions in less than 48 hours. The room smelled of cold wax and coffee, punctuated by the scratching of pens and the occasional phone call to division commanders in the field. Patton's voice cut through, claiming that Third Army could be in Bastogne within 48 hours, a statement documented in the weather prayer file, which recorded both operational plans and a personal request for clear skies. Vehicles numbering 16,000, including M4 Sherman tanks, M3 half-tracks, and GMC CCKW trucks, would need to traverse frozen roads and snowed-in passes with minimal delay. The audacity of the plan stunned staff officers, but Patton's meticulous staff work ensured that ration points, fuel dumps, and ammunition stockpiles were plotted precisely. Each division's axis of advance was measured in kilometers, with timing synchronized down to the hour. Technical details of the maneuver revealed its extraordinary complexity. Division planners calculated that each M4 Sherman, averaging 12 miles per gallon, required at least 4 mobile fuel trucks per column to maintain continuous motion over 60 kilometers of snow-packed terrain. Communications were routed through field telephones with 35 kilometers of wire, supplemented by radio relays using SCR 284 units capable of 50-watt transmissions. Each regiment's artillery complement included 12 105mm howitzers per battalion, requiring coordinated unloading points along the pivot route. Intelligence officers cross-referenced weather forecasts and reconnaissance photos identifying icy slopes and forest choke points that could reduce vehicle speed by up to 40%. The planning accounted for German ambushes, roadblocks, and artillery fire, ensuring that supply lines remained intact despite enemy interference. Comparisons between Allied and German operational flexibility became immediately clear. German units in the Ardennes relied on decentralized orders, often delayed by communication breakdowns and fuel shortages, which immobilized nearly 60% of Panther and Panzer IV units. By contrast, Patton's staff maintained real-time adjustments through courier reports, wire communications, and weather analysis, allowing a pivot operation impossible under German doctrine. Whereas the Wehrmacht prioritized frontline spearheads with minimal logistical redundancy, Third Army executed simultaneous movement of armor, infantry, and support units, minimizing vulnerability while maintaining forward momentum. This integrated approach gave the Allies both speed and operational resilience, preventing the stalling that plagued German advances. Field evidence of the pivot's effectiveness was apparent by December 22nd, when lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division reached the Bastogne perimeter, 36 kilometers from their original axis of advance. Tanks and half-tracks maintained an average speed of 10 kilometers per hour despite snow and mud, while engineers cleared 6 fallen trees and 2 partially destroyed bridges along Route Nationale 66. Forward observers noted that German artillery fire had diminished significantly as air power continued to harass rear units, confirming intelligence reports from ultra-intercepts about fuel shortages and command confusion. The synchronized arrival of combat teams and supply units ensured Bastogne's defenders could hold key intersections without interruption. The broader implications became immediately apparent to chaff planners. A successful link-up with Bastogne would not only relieve encircled troops, but also threaten the flanks of the German Ardennes offensive. Patton's ability to pivot in 48 hours underlined a level of operational flexibility unmatched by the Wehrmacht, forcing German commanders to reconsider their tactical assumptions. Ultra-intelligence intercepted messages indicating that Sixth SS Panzer Army was shifting reserves to plug gaps exposed by Third Army's movement. The success of the maneuver underscored the importance of integrated planning, superior logistics, and bold decision-making under pressure. Additional supporting evidence emerged from Patton's own diaries and operational logs. Weather analysis, documented in the weather profile, showed that clear skies on December 21st and 22nd coincided perfectly with the Third Army advance, allowing aerial reconnaissance and artillery observation to guide units safely. By contrast, German forces had suffered continuous setbacks from frozen roads and fuel depletion, leaving armoured spearheads vulnerable to Allied interdiction. Reports from the 37th Tank Battalion noted that Panther serial numbers 73218 and 73405 were immobilized due to iced-over fuel lines, while M4 Shermans proceeded without interruption. The contrast between the two armies highlighted not only technical preparedness, but also the human initiative embedded in Third Army doctrine. Human and operational consequences were profound. Soldiers, exhausted by previous engagements in the Ardennes, found renewed morale as the approach of Patton's divisions promised relief and reinforcement. Commanders documented that the rapid advance prevented German forces from concentrating firepower on Bastogne, saving lives and stabilizing defensive positions. Civilians in Luxembourg and southern Belgium witnessed Allied convoys moving through towns previously threatened by artillery, bringing essential supplies and signaling a shift in battlefield momentum. Field nurses and medics recorded the evacuation of wounded soldiers to cleared zones along the advance, highlighting the direct human benefit of operational audacity. By the end of December 22nd, Patton's Third Army had demonstrated the decisive impact of preparation, audacity, and precise execution. The 90-degree pivot involving 16,000 vehicles and 3 divisions successfully reached Bastogne, rescuing encircled troops and preserving critical junctions. German forces, confronted with immobilized armor, fuel shortages, and renewed Allied pressure, faced the erosion of their offensive advantage. The Third Army's achievement showcased the operational superiority of integrated planning and rapid execution under winter conditions, setting the stage for the prolonged counteroffensive that would ultimately drive the Wehrmacht back. Patton had turned north, and with him, the tide of the Ardennes began to shift irreversibly. December 24th, 1944, near Hoffeleis, Belgium, infantrymen of the 26th Infantry Regiment, huddled in foxholes, their wool socks frozen solid, faces numbed by temperatures plunging to -20 degrees Celsius, while snow swirled in a persistent wind that reduced visibility to under 50 meters. German soldiers of the 9th Volksgrenadier Division crouched behind shattered walls, rifles coated with ice, struggling to light improvised stoves using a single match per squad. The landscape had become a frozen tomb, and field reports from the Third Army documented 45,000 frostbite cases in Allied units alone. Ammunition caches froze in open crates, forcing soldiers to pour snow over shells to prevent rupture. Foxholes filled with slush as ice-crusted earth cracked underfoot, and the faint groans of the wounded rose from shallow trenches. Medics recorded their inability to evacuate casualties over snow-laden roads, noting that a single stretcher took 30 minutes to move 50 meters. The cold was universal. It punished both attackers and defenders with equal cruelty. Technical examination of winter attrition revealed glaring deficiencies in German logistics. Only 25% of units possessed fully issued winter uniforms, leaving soldiers with single-layer tunics and worn leather boots. Fuel shortages limited the operation of half-tracks and trucks, reducing mobile artillery support by nearly 60%. US quartermasters improvised fuel can heaters using 20-liter jerry cans filled with kerosene, producing minimal warmth for small units. Engineers attempted to insulate water and fuel lines with burlap, yet freezing temperatures still caused pumps to seize, delaying both frontline and supply movements. Winterization procedures documented in the German Army High Command's Operations Manual, OKH Heeresgruppe B Sonderbericht 15, showed that equipment left unmodified for sub-zero conditions lost operational capacity by 35%. Every delay directly affected troop survivability and operational effectiveness. Comparisons between Allied and German adaptation to winter conditions highlighted stark contrasts. American units, relying on improvised heating and layered clothing, maintained roughly 70% combat effectiveness, while German formations often fell below 50% due to frostbite and hypothermia. Allied engineering corps, using portable stoves and snow-clearing teams, preserved vehicle mobility longer than German panzergrenadier columns, which became mired in icy roads and frozen bridges. Whereas German doctrine emphasized speed and offensive initiative, US forces emphasized preservation of strength and adaptability, leveraging quartermaster ingenuity to sustain defensive positions. These differences not only affected immediate survivability, but also the capacity to mount effective counterattacks under extreme conditions. Field evidence reinforced the deadly impact of winter attrition. On December 25th, a forward observer in Bastogne noted that German 88mm artillery pieces could not be relocated due to icebound ground and frozen tow cables, leaving them vulnerable to aerial reconnaissance. Rifle companies improvised snow berms which allowed limited observation and return fire while minimizing exposure. Medics documented that stretcher teams required 3 times the normal manpower to move wounded through waist-deep snow. Reports from the 110th Field Artillery Battalion indicated that their howitzer shells, cooled to -15 degrees Celsius, displayed altered powder burn rates, slightly reducing range and accuracy. Each frozen element, men, ammunition, vehicles interacted cumulatively to slow both armies and amplify casualties. The broader implications of the Iron Winter became clear by December 26. Attrition caused a shift in strategic tempo, as both sides expended manpower and material for minimal territorial gain. German commanders, unable to rotate units or maintain supply lines, faced increasing difficulty organizing a coherent retreat. Allied forces, while suffering frostbite and slowed resupply, were positioned to exploit any collapse in the German front. Intelligence reports highlighted that units immobilized by ice and snow could be overtaken or encircled, demonstrating the battlefield was now defined as much by temperature and terrain as by firepower. Additional supporting evidence came from official unit diaries and correspondence. The 2nd Panzer Division's daily report of December 25th described that 4 of 10 trucks carrying ammunition had frozen fuel lines, immobilizing 80 rounds of 75mm shells. 101st Airborne notes recorded that makeshift shelters heated by kerosene cans allowed only 3 hours of operational readiness for small squads before exhaustion set in. Comparative analysis with prior campaigns revealed that Allied improvisation mitigated losses more effectively than German reliance on pre-war doctrine, showing adaptability as a decisive factor under extreme weather conditions. The human and operational consequences were devastating. Soldiers endured both combat and the relentless environment, with frostbite amputations performed in field hospitals under candlelight. Delays in medical evacuation and supply replenishment contributed directly to battlefield casualties and diminished unit cohesion. Commanders noted decreased morale and increased desertion risks under prolonged exposure. Yet, the persistence of both sides demonstrated remarkable endurance, as men adapted to make fire, melt snow for water, and ration food amid extreme hardship. The environment itself had become a silent combatant, punishing every miscalculation and testing human resilience to its limits. By December 27th, the Iron Winter had defined the Ardennes battlefield. Frostbite cases exceeded 45,000, German winter uniforms remained critically short, and both armies faced severe resupply challenges that dictated tactical choices. The extreme conditions slowed Patton's advance and forced German commanders to confront the impossibility of sustained offensive action under freezing temperatures. The frozen landscape, lethal in its impartiality, shaped both operational tempo and human endurance, making weather as formidable an adversary as the opposing army. Survival, adaptation, and attrition now determined the course of the campaign, setting the stage for the eventual German withdrawal and the failure of their Ardennes gamble. January 1st, 1945, High Command Headquarters, Bad Nauheim, Germany. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt pored over operational maps spread across a heavy oak table, each inked line marking crumbling German positions along the Ardennes, while General Ober's Walter Model received urgent reports of depleted units, unable to hold even the most rudimentary defenses. Rundstedt's voice, recorded in the OKW Situation Bericht Nr. 102, urged Hitler to withdraw to the West Wall, citing untenable losses and overstretched supply lines. Yet Hitler's reply arrived with his typical fury. The offensive continues. At the front, units of the Sixth Panzer Army struggled to maintain coherence, reporting over 700 tanks immobilized or destroyed since December 17th. Infantry formations, reduced to 50% strength, held trenches against overwhelming Allied reinforcements from the Third and Ninth Armies. Artillery shells rattled through villages like metal hail, marking the limits of Germany's remaining reserves. Strategic reality pressed hard, yet political loyalty overrode operational logic. Technical analysis revealed the devastating attrition the German army had endured. Panzer losses exceeded 700 vehicles, including 120 Tiger I and Panther tanks, lost to mechanical failure and combat. Fuel shortages, documented in Heeresgruppe B Logbuch Nr. 78, left over 60% of mechanized units immobilized. Ammunition consumption rates reached unsustainable levels, with heavy artillery expending nearly 15,000 rounds in 4 days, outpacing resupply capabilities. Comparison with Allied stockpiles indicated that while the Germans faced critical shortages, US forces maintained reserves sufficient to sustain 2 weeks of continuous operations. Communication failures compounded these losses, with 33% of frontline radios inoperative due to frozen batteries or damage. Each depleted vehicle or empty gun tube eroded Germany's ability to project force beyond the immediate front. Comparative analysis of Allied versus German endurance exposed stark differences in doctrine and execution. While German strategy relied on rapid mechanized breakthroughs, the Allies adopted a layered defense with staggered reserves, allowing replenishment even under winter conditions. American infantry divisions, supported by continuous supply via truck convoys and airmail dropped supplies, retained roughly 75% operational effectiveness despite frostbite and minor vehicle losses. By contrast, German units, operating under the dual pressure of attrition and Hitler's unyielding directives, suffered critical degradation of combat power, with entire battalions reduced to skeletal formations. These contrasts emphasized that logistical sustainability, rather than battlefield courage, had become the decisive factor. Field evidence reinforced the stark reality of depletion. On December 29th, a report from the 116th Panzer Division noted that 4 of their 12 remaining Panther tanks were immobilized due to frozen tracks and fuel lines, while the remaining 8 operated at reduced efficiency due to mechanical strain. Allied reconnaissance, confirmed through photographic intelligence in CSF Intercept Report 44, Mies 3, documented over 700 destroyed German vehicles along the Hoffelise corridor. Infantry accounts detailed the exhaustion of soldiers forced to man artillery positions with minimal shelter, often under artillery fire. Each observation confirmed that the German High Command was confronting a structural collapse rather than a mere tactical setback. The broader strategic implications became unavoidable. With panzer divisions largely immobilized and infantry reduced to 50% operational strength, Rundstedt and Model recognized that the Ardennes offensive could no longer achieve its objectives. The arrival of Allied reinforcements from the Third and Ninth Armies intensified pressure on weakened flanks, threatening encirclement of German formations. Orders from Berlin insisting on continuation of the offensive exacerbated the strain, forcing commanders to commit remaining reserves into increasingly desperate actions. Reports indicated that Operation Nordwind, launched simultaneously on January 1st in Alsace, was the final attempt to regain momentum, yet units already reported supply shortages and minimal artillery support. Additional evidence from diaries and reports confirmed the hopelessness of the position. Model's daily war diary entry of January 2nd recorded, Units are exhausted. The offensive exceeds the limits of endurance. Luftwaffe sorties failed to provide meaningful air support, as Operation Bodenplatz's earlier losses had decimated fighter strength, leaving German columns exposed. Allied artillery and air reconnaissance exploited every weak point, compounding disarray. Comparative analysis with prior Western Front operations revealed that German forces were now conducting defensive maneuvers under the guise of offensive action, with the illusion of progress maintained only through strict adherence to orders from Hitler. Human and operational consequences were severe. Casualties reached over 120,000 by early January, while frontline units experienced severe exhaustion and morale collapse. Soldiers reported extreme cold, shortages of food and ammunition, and the inability to rotate frontline troops, producing both physical and psychological attrition. Commanders faced impossible decisions: commit depleted battalions to counterattacks, or abandon positions and risk punitive repercussions from higher command. Civilians in the Ardennes, caught in the crossfire, experienced displacement and collateral casualties, with winter conditions amplifying suffering. Loyalty had become entwined with operational ruin. By January 3rd, the West Wall represented both a physical and symbolic limit. Germany's final reserves were shattered, panzer divisions decimated, and Allied forces poised to exploit every weakness. Rundstedt and Model understood that the Ardennes gamble had exhausted the army's offensive capacity, yet political obedience sustained the illusion of action. The combination of attrition, logistical collapse, and Allied reinforcement made recovery impossible, marking the definitive turning point in the West. The bitter truth crystallized: Hitler's gamble had failed, leaving the German High Command to confront the collapse of strategy, morale, and the remnants of their army along the frozen front. January 8, 1945, L'Église, Belgium. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe ignited the last of their operational tanks, 12 Panzer IVs and 5 Tiger Ts, detonating internal fuel lines and ammunition stores with precision charges, leaving a smoldering barricade across the frozen road. Soldiers tramped through knee-deep snow, dragging heavy MG-42s and sporadically firing their remaining Panzerfasts at shadows they could barely discern in the winter gloom. Hitler's long-delayed order to withdraw, delivered via the OKW telegram NORS 2154, codified a retreat that had already begun organically as columns fractured under persistent American artillery and airstrikes. Bridges over the Amblev and Salm rivers had been blown, isolating units and forcing convoys onto ice-slick detours. Civilians cautiously emerged from bombed-out basements in Stavelot, surveying streets layered with debris and frozen corpses. Exhausted soldiers tracked the path of their former advance, witnessing wrecked vehicles, abandoned winter rations, and scattered personal effects frozen into the landscape. Technical reports from the 1st SS Panzer Division indicate that of the original 45 operational tanks at the start of December, only 17 remained mobile by January 8th. Fuel consumption for mechanized units averaged 1 mile per gallon under cold conditions, a severe disadvantage compared with US Sherman tanks achieving roughly 1.5 miles per gallon over comparable terrain. Ammunition stocks were depleted by 72%, with artillery unable to support the retreating infantry effectively. Luftwaffe sorties failed to deliver the promised resupply, largely due to weather and prior losses, leaving ground forces vulnerable to Allied air dominance. The combination of frozen engines, exhausted crews, and destroyed infrastructure made traditional tactical maneuvers impossible. Reports logged in the Heeresgruppe B Rückzug protocol noted a critical deficiency in fuel and munitions sufficient to immobilize over 50% of armored units within 24 hours. Comparative analysis highlights the stark operational asymmetry between the retreating Germans and advancing Allies. American divisions, supported by P-47 Thunderbolt strikes and continuous truck convoys, maintained approximately 70% mobility despite snow accumulation reaching 30 centimeters in some areas. Allied artillery and air reconnaissance allowed for predictive targeting of German convoys, which lacked both electronic communication and sufficient armored escort. Whereas the German army struggled with logistical collapse, the US forces executed a combined arms approach, integrating ground and air units to maintain pressure while minimizing attrition. Even with equal numbers of frontline troops in some sectors, the operational efficiency of US forces remained double that of German units, emphasizing how supply and coordination defined battlefield effectiveness more than raw manpower. Field evidence of the collapse was immediate and brutal. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Regiment on January 9th noted that retreating columns encountered repeated air interdiction, with over 60 vehicles destroyed within 6 hours by strafing runs. Infantry attempting to cover the withdrawal suffered casualties from both aerial bombardment and American artillery, with one battalion losing 35% of its remaining effective strength while crossing the blown-out Hoffeleis Bridge. Personal accounts describe soldiers slipping on ice-coated roads, abandoning heavy equipment and improvising shelters in barns and basements. Photographic reconnaissance, captured in SAATESEE Intelligence Report 88 Nights 2, confirmed lines of burned-out Panzer IVs stretching over 3 kilometers along the main retreat corridor. Each incident reflected the cumulative consequence of operational paralysis, signaling the effective end of the Ardennes offensive. The broader implications of the withdrawal became unmistakable within hours. With German casualties approaching 100,000 and Allied losses near 75,000, the Ardennes had transformed into a graveyard for both armies, yet the strategic advantage now clearly favored the Allies. The destruction of infrastructure, bridges, roads, and rail lines was intended to delay pursuit, yet US engineers rapidly cleared key routes within 48 hours, restoring mobility to armored columns. The retreat revealed that Hitler's insistence on continued offensive action had cost Germany irreplaceable material and manpower. Units in the front line reported exhaustion, frostbite, and logistical starvation, making any potential counterattack implausible. Additional supporting evidence shows German morale at a nadir. Letters from soldiers of the 2nd Panzer Division, archived in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, describe despair over abandoned comrades and immobile vehicles. Winter clothing shortages and frozen rations compounded the collapse, while Allied control of the skies exposed every movement to reconnaissance and attack. Comparisons with US doctrine show the stark contrast. American units adapted to weather, integrated resupply, and rotated personnel, preserving combat readiness, while German soldiers endured a relentless attrition spiral. Commanders increasingly prioritized survival over orders, leading to fragmented units and impromptu decisions on abandoning equipment. Human and operational consequences manifested in profound suffering and permanent loss. Entire companies ceased to exist as cohesive formations. Soldiers succumbed to frostbite and exhaustion in foxholes, and armored crews abandoned their vehicles in the snow, detonating charges to prevent capture. Civilians traversing ruined towns faced both the remnants of combat and the physical devastation of the environment, witnessing burned-out tanks, shattered buildings, and scattered personal belongings frozen into ice. Commanders lost situational awareness as retreating units became increasingly isolated. The psychological toll, combined with physical attrition, ensured that German forces could no longer function as an offensive entity. By January 10th, the Ardennes stood as a testament to the collapse of Hitler's last major gamble in the West. Mechanized units were largely destroyed or abandoned, infantry decimated, and bridges destroyed to slow the inevitable Allied advance. The retreat revealed the unsustainable nature of German logistics, command rigidity, and overextension in the face of combined Allied firepower. The offensive ended not with a formal surrender, but through systemic disintegration, leaving the Reich exposed to subsequent Allied operations. The Ardennes Offensive's final chapter underscored that operational collapse, magnified by winter, logistical failure, and relentless opposition, had irreversibly shifted momentum toward the Allies, setting the stage for the advance into Germany. January 15th, 1945, Fechef Headquarters, Versailles, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed a map table littered with colored pins representing U.S. divisions, their movements tracked against the Ardennes' frozen terrain, while piles of casualty reports from December 16th to January 8th were stacked beside him. The map showed a now erased Bulge, once a German penetration of 55 kilometers, its contours highlighted in red ink by staff officers. Eisenhower read aloud from the situation report: 19,000 Americans killed, 75,000 wounded or missing, 700 tanks destroyed, 1,000 artillery pieces lost. His voice carrying the weight of stark reality. Staff officers adjusted markers representing German losses: over 100,000 casualties, 700 operational panzer vehicles lost, and shattered infantry formations. Hospitals in Bastogne had been cleared, yet corridors remained lined with stretchers bearing frostbitten and frost-shocked soldiers. Eisenhower's concluding note, "No one is invincible," echoed in the room, a reminder that tactical success carried a hidden cost. The generals studied the frozen landscape on the table, visualizing every road interdicted, every village shelled, every forested slope contested. Technical analysis revealed the interplay of weather, logistics, and battlefield attrition. Army Quartermaster reports documented that fuel consumption among Sherman tanks averaged 1.5 miles per gallon over snow-compacted roads, while Panzer IVs under identical conditions managed barely 1 mile per gallon. Ammunition expenditure reached levels previously unseen in the European theatre, with artillery firing over 30,000 rounds during the first week of the battle. Photographic reconnaissance and aerial mapping confirmed that German columns had been reduced to fragmented units, often immobilized in snowdrifts or abandoned behind destroyed bridges. SAAF Intelligence Document 112B highlighted that air superiority allowed continuous interdiction, eroding the enemy's cohesion and operational capacity. Each statistic, meticulously recorded, painted a picture of attrition that even the victorious Allies could scarcely absorb without sacrifice. A comparison between opposing systems underscored the strategic asymmetry despite the Germans' tactical surprise. German mechanized units, reliant on a precarious fuel supply and insufficient winter uniforms, suffered a 35% immobilization rate by January 5th. Divisions leveraged integrated logistics, rotating fuel trucks, and field engineers to maintain mobility at 70% efficiency. Where the Wehrmacht relied on ad hoc retreat routes and destroyed bridges, the Americans rapidly repaired critical crossings, allowing tanks and artillery to sustain counterattacks. Communication networks provided real-time coordination among artillery, armor, and air support, a stark contrast to German reliance on fragmented radio relays and courier dispatches. This systemic disparity magnified even slight numerical advantages into decisive battlefield effects. But field evidence confirmed these disparities. Reports from the 28th Infantry Division documented clearing operations along Route Nationale 62, where frozen corpses of both US and German soldiers were catalogued for burial. Reconnaissance photographs from the 9th Air Force displayed lines of destroyed Panzer IVs, Panther tanks and half-tracks, often clustered in terrain funnels created by demolished bridges or snowdrifts. American artillery batteries, firing in coordinated barrages from elevated positions around Hoffelise, had obliterated German defensive strongpoints while conserving infantry strength. Personal accounts describe GIs returning to the forests in sub-zero temperatures to interfallen comrades, improvising wooden crosses marked with dog tags and unit designations. The meticulous recording of losses and destruction reinforced the dual reality: victory had been won, yet at a cost that weighed heavily on command judgment. Broader implications of the Ardennes battle became increasingly clear as the Allied staff analyzed operational maps. The failed German offensive had expended nearly all available reserves in the west, depleting fuel, artillery, and armored units, rendering further offensive operations impossible. Strategic analysts projected that German capabilities would not recover before the spring thaw, with over 100 kilometers of Ardennes terrain firmly under Allied control. The Bulge, once threatening deep penetration into the Third Army's rear, had been erased by January 23rd, restoring pre-offensive front lines. Commanders recognized that the battle demonstrated the perils of overconfidence, rigid adherence to orders, and underestimation of logistical constraints. Every red mark on the map represented not only a tactical success, but a ledger of human sacrifice and material destruction. Additional evidence highlighted the complex logistical efforts required even after victory. Recovery teams in Bastogne reopened hospitals, clearing over 3,000 wounded soldiers for transport to rear area medical facilities. Engineers rebuilt destroyed bridges within 48 hours, restoring mobility for artillery and supply convoys, while motorized divisions prepared for winter redeployment. Comparisons between German and US practices revealed that, while the Wehrmacht had relied on destructive retreat tactics to slow pursuit, Allied forces prioritized consolidation, resupply, and rapid restoration of operational capacity. Field diaries from the 101st Airborne Division noted that the recovery of frozen supplies, fuel canisters, and ammunition depots was as critical to maintaining momentum as combat itself. These efforts ensured that the victory could be exploited strategically, rather than allowing attrition to sap the force's effectiveness. Human and operational consequences remained stark. 19,000 Americans killed and 75,000 wounded or missing left permanent scars on units and communities. Soldiers bore witness to destroyed towns, frozen rivers, and collapsed villages, some marked by improvised cemeteries for comrades. Morale among surviving troops fluctuated between relief and exhaustion, tempered by the knowledge that even tactical success demanded immense sacrifice. Commanders reviewed both the effectiveness and the limitations of their approach, noting that while integrated air-ground operations had saved countless lives, overconfidence and underestimation of enemy capacity could have yielded disaster. Every report reinforced the duality of victory: strategic success accompanied by operational and emotional cost. By late January, the Ardennes campaign closed as both a tactical triumph and a sobering lesson. Material losses, including 700 tanks and 1,000 artillery pieces, demonstrated that victory exacts a price in both men and machines. Strategic maps, meticulously updated, erased the German Bulge, Yet every red mark reminded commanders that preparedness, adaptability, and caution were as vital as bravery and firepower. The battle proved that even a successful counteroffensive could not be disentangled from its human and material toll. Eisenhower's assessment, "No one is invincible," resonated beyond the meeting room, encapsulating the war's hard truth that victory and loss coexist in the ledger of history, and that overconfidence can kill even when success is achieved. The Ardennes thus became both a triumph of coordination and endurance, and a warning of the persistent dangers inherent in war's uncertainty. January 16th, 1945, Führerbunker, Berlin, Germany. Adolf Hitler sat behind the polished mahogany desk in the dimly lit command room, a stack of censored casualty reports pushed aside by his outstretched hand as he barked, "The Allies will break apart." Officers from the Oberkommando des Heeres shuffled quietly, documents clutched in trembling hands, knowing that any mention of actual losses, 19,000 Americans killed at the Ardennes, 75,000 wounded or missing, and German casualties exceeding 100,000 would be disregarded. Maps of the Western and Eastern fronts littered the walls, alongside technical schematics of the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger II and V-2 rockets, each annotated with potential deployment zones. General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the General Staff, placed a report detailing the collapse of Army Group A along the Eastern Front onto the desk, only to see it ignored, buried under the Führer's insistence on miracle weapons. The room's air was thick with the acrid smell of cigarette smoke, mingling with the faint metallic odor from the air raid shelter ventilation. Hitler dictated orders for accelerated production of jet fighters and Sturmgeschütz 4 assault guns, emphasizing unattainable deadlines. Officers exchanged glances. The distance between operational reality and Hitler's fantasy had become tangible. Technical details underscored the widening chasm between perception and reality. Wehrmacht morale reports, recently delivered from the Western Front, indicated that only 35% of frontline infantry units remained at full combat effectiveness, while panzer divisions averaged 20 to 30% operational readiness due to fuel shortages and mechanical attrition. The Führerbunker staff filtered casualty figures and supply assessments, preventing Hitler from receiving unvarnished data. Comparatively, Allied forces maintained 70 to 80% efficiency in combined arms coordination, with Sherman tanks averaging 1.5 miles per gallon on snow-compacted roads and artillery batteries firing 30,000 rounds within the first week of the Ardennes counteroffensive. These discrepancies revealed that the German military machine, once considered invincible, could not sustain operations without critical supply lines or accurate intelligence. Comparing German and Allied strategic systems further highlighted the consequences of delusion. US forces relied on integrated logistics and real-time coordination between air armor and infantry units, allowing rapid exploitation of gaps in German lines. In contrast, German divisions were forced to improvise, often retreating behind destroyed bridges or immobilized vehicles, with fuel depots captured or destroyed by Allied air interdiction. The disparity in command flexibility meant that even with local tactical competence, German units could not recover operational momentum. Hitler's insistence on continued offensives ignored these systemic limitations, producing orders that were impossible to implement under actual battlefield conditions. Field evidence in reports from January 14th to 16th confirmed operational collapse. Units from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and 12th Volksgrenadier Division were immobilized along frozen roads near St. Vith, with over 50% of vehicles abandoned due to fuel exhaustion. Engineers recorded destroyed bridges and demolished crossroads intended to delay Allied pursuit, yet these measures could not compensate for depleted manpower or mechanical readiness. Luftwaffe sorties were limited to 40% of planned missions due to aircraft losses and weather, compared with near-continuous Allied air superiority. Personal diaries captured officers' frustration at receiving impossible orders, reflecting the widening gulf between Hitler's vision and operational reality. The broader implications of Hitler's isolation became apparent as the Wehrmacht's strategic options dwindled. With the Ardennes defeat erasing the Western Front bulge, production bottlenecks, and severe attrition meant no reserves remained for counteroffensive operations. Reports projected that Army Group A and Army Group Center could not withstand the Soviet advance without immediate reinforcement, yet the Führer refused to acknowledge the Eastern Front collapse. Analysts calculated that without accurate intelligence, and with 50% of armored divisions non-operational, Germany's remaining capacity to resist was limited to delaying actions and localized defensive fights. The cumulative effect of these misjudgments threatened to accelerate the Reich's final collapse. Additional documentation highlighted the bureaucratic insulation surrounding Hitler. Staff officers, aware of the Führer's psychological state, systematically censored reports and adjusted Wehrmacht morale assessments, reporting 80 to 90% confidence where field units barely functioned at 30%. Supply forecasts for jet fighter prototypes, V-2 rockets, and Sturmgeschütz assault guns were inflated, producing planning schedules that could never be met. Comparative analysis showed that Allied strategic intelligence, combined with operational transparency, permitted realistic assessments and timely tactical adjustments. The lack of similar transparency within German command structures rendered any plan dictated by Hitler effectively unattainable. Human and operational consequences were severe. Units operating under impossible directives faced catastrophic attrition, with soldiers enduring frozen terrain, shortages of winter clothing, and fragmented command. The Wehrmacht's morale, already degraded from successive failures, fell further as officers and enlisted men recognized the futility of planned miracle operations. Retreat orders, often contradictory, led to unnecessary losses during withdrawals, while civilian populations along evacuation routes witnessed the collapse of military authority. The psychological toll on commanders like Guderian, who attempted to reconcile reality with the Führer's delusions, mirrored the physical disintegration of German forces. By late January, Hitler's retreat into fantasy had sealed Germany's strategic fate. The Ardennes failure, combined with Eastern Front disasters, revealed that operational reality could no longer be reconciled with dictatorial whim. Supply deficiencies, armored losses, and decimated morale rendered further offensives impossible. Allied efficiency, accurate intelligence, and superior logistics ensured that Germany could no longer mount meaningful resistance. Hitler's isolation in the Berlin bunker, insulated from truth by censored reports and filtered assessments, exemplified the final delusion of a regime incapable of adapting to its own collapse. The war's conclusion now depended on the Allies pressing forward before the Soviets reached the capital, with the Reich's will to fight disintegrating alongside its remaining operational capacity. April 1st, 1946. Nuremberg, Bavaria, Germany. The courtroom of the American Military Tribunal, filled with the echoes of survivors' voices, as 27 SS officers from the 1st SS Panzer Corps were led in under steel restraints, their boots clattering against the marble floor. Witnesses from Malmedy, Stavelot, and Tros-Ponce were seated, clutching personal diaries, letters, and photographs documenting atrocities committed during the Ardennes Offensive. Prosecutor Telford Taylor, adjusted his spectacles, and read aloud the indictment, citing the murder of 189 civilians and captured American POWs, referencing the official Allied documentation compiled in the Malmedy Massacre Report, document number AMG 1945-78. Peiper, flanked by guards, sat impassively, his uniform marked with the insignia of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, while outside, the snow-packed streets of Nuremberg reflected the harsh light through shattered windows from wartime bombings. Every detail mattered: the serial numbers of captured Waffen-SS vehicles, the kilometers of destroyed infrastructure, and the specific orders allegedly transmitted by Peiper on December 17th and 18th, 1944. The atmosphere was tense, a collision of moral judgment and procedural precision. Technical evidence played a pivotal role in unraveling operational responsibility. Investigators meticulously reconstructed column movements, verifying that Peiper's Kampfgruppe destroyed at least 22 bridges and fired 2,000 rounds of artillery against retreating Allied forces and civilian homes. German communication logs indicated repeated orders to take no prisoners in specific villages, while vehicle registration numbers, such as SD.Kaif says, 251 half-tracks and Panther tanks, were cross-referenced with eyewitness accounts. The tribunal compared these records to Allied resupply logs, noting that American forces could neither anticipate these movements nor prevent atrocities due to frozen terrain and disrupted communications. Forensic analysis of battlefield remnants confirmed that many of the civilian deaths resulted from intentional execution rather than collateral damage, a distinction central to war crimes adjudication. A comparative perspective revealed the stark operational differences between the warring systems. U.S. forces adhered to explicit rules of engagement, documented in field manuals FM-27, 10 and FM-733, emphasizing POW treatment and civilian protection. In contrast, German SS units operated under ideological imperatives, prioritizing ruthless speed and terror over strategic restraint. While U.S. infantry units in the Ninth Army maintained structured casualty evacuation procedures and followed prescribed roadblock protocols to safeguard civilians, German mechanized columns often bypassed logistical discipline in favor of tactical expediency, exposing both troops and non-combatants to extreme risk. The operational consequences were tangible. Allied losses were concentrated in combat, whereas German actions provoked broader ethical and strategic fallout. Field investigations corroborated survivor testimonies. Interviews conducted in Stavelot documented the deaths of 43 civilians and the execution of 24 American POWs, with photographs taken by the Ninth Army's photographic section cataloguing destroyed homes and burned vehicles. Local infrastructure assessments measured 6 bridges demolished along the Amblev River, with lengths ranging from 20 to 50 meters, obstructing pursuit routes and endangering retreating German troops. Forensic reports noted bullet trajectories, shell fragments, and vehicle tracks, establishing both sequence and intent of violent acts. Such evidence reinforced claims made during Peiper's trial, indicating premeditation and systematic execution of unlawful orders. Broader implications of these findings became increasingly clear. The Ardennes campaign, once lauded in German propaganda for tactical audacity, revealed profound moral collapse, exposing the consequences of combining ideological zeal with operational authority. Allied forces documented that at least 75% of German SS units in the offensive were implicated in some form of war crime, highlighting systemic rather than isolated failures. Such revelations influenced post-war occupation policies, including denazification programs and the restructuring of German military doctrine to prevent recurrence. The trials also provided a template for understanding command responsibility in modern military jurisprudence. Additional evidence emphasized the chain of command's complicity. Interrogations of captured officers, such as Hauptsturmführer Joachim Peiper and Standartenführer Hermann Giesler, revealed discrepancies between field orders and operational reports, confirming that senior officers enforced executions despite awareness of civilian presence. Allied interrogators noted that Wehrmacht regular army officers occasionally attempted to intervene, but SS ideological cohesion prevented dissent. Comparative analysis with US armored units, which strictly followed the 1st Armored Division operational protocol for engagement in civilian areas, demonstrated how institutional culture shapes both strategy and morality. Documentation included written confessions, aerial reconnaissance photos, and post-war witness statements, all meticulously catalogued in the Allied Military Government Archives, File AMG 1946-12. Human and operational consequences were profound. Survivors of Stavelot and Malmedy described families displaced, homes destroyed, and an atmosphere of terror extending far beyond immediate combat zones. Investigators observed that German units, though tactically mobile, were operationally compromised by ethical transgressions that slowed retreats, provoked reprisal attacks, and exposed troops to additional Allied fire. American troops returning to battlefields to bury comrades encountered a landscape scarred by both winter and human cruelty, forcing soldiers and civilians alike to confront the moral costs of victory. These realities underscored the entwined nature of operational efficiency and ethical responsibility. By the conclusion of the trials, the Ardennes had been framed as both a strategic and moral reckoning. Peiper received a sentence of death in July 1946, later commuted, while other 1st SS Panzer Corps officers faced varied prison terms, establishing a precedent for accountability. Allied documentation, survivor testimony, and forensic evidence collectively preserved the campaign's lessons, ensuring that the winter's violence would not fade into myth. Memory, legal record, and historical analysis combined to define the Ardennes as more than a military engagement. It became a measure of justice against calculated cruelty. The reckoning extended beyond punishment, shaping post-war understanding of how operational conduct intersects with humanity in the theater of war. Spring 1951, Hollywood, California, United States. The set of Battleground recreated Bastogne's frozen streets with painstaking precision, 75 tons of artificial snow covering cobbled surfaces and mock rubble, as director William Wellman orchestrated explosions timed to exact seconds. Veterans from the 101st Airborne Division were consulted to verify vehicle positions, including M4A3 Shermans and M24 Chaffies, while American extras donned reproduced M1943 field jackets and helmets, numbered sequentially for authenticity. Technical advisors mapped German Panther and Tiger tanks advancing along the Wiltz River, referencing U.S. Army Center of Military History reports from 1948 to 1954, ensuring that artillery impact zones matched original coordinates. Cameras rolled over frozen craters, measured at 3 meters in diameter, capturing the illusion of chaos, while the original battle had left actual craters of up to 5 meters, displacing thousands of tons of earth. The film's opening sequence emphasized suspense and heroism, dramatizing the Bulge while omitting much of the logistical collapse documented in Allied operational maps. Historians analyzing post-war sources uncovered technical distortions and omissions. Army Center of Military History reports Quantified material losses: 700 tanks destroyed, 1,000 field guns disabled, and 19,000 American casualties, yet popular narratives reduced these figures to create a sense of manageable adversity. Veterans' oral histories collected in the late 1950s emphasized frostbite cases exceeding 45,000, supply shortages, and chaotic communications, details largely absent from cinematic portrayals. Eisenhower's memoirs, published in 1947, defended Allied leadership decisions, noting that rapid reinforcement from the Third and Ninth Armies prevented total collapse, a nuance often overshadowed by mythologized heroism. Technical evidence demonstrated that the miracle of Bastogne rested as much on logistical improvisation, fuel can heaters, emergency rations, and ad hoc field hospitals as on battlefield valor. A comparative lens revealed how memory diverged from reality. West German accounts in the early 1950s framed the Ardennes as a testament to bravery despite defeat, highlighting Wehrmacht endurance while downplaying the criminal actions of SS units. By contrast, American narratives emphasized unity, surprise, and fortitude, often omitting operational blunders and intelligence failures. And German veterans recalled weather-imposed mobility limitations, such as snowpack measuring up to 50 centimeters. Yet films and memoirs compressed these factors into concise dramatic motifs. The practical effect was a battle of legend that aligned Cold War sensibilities with Western unity, casting the Allies as paragons of moral and strategic rectitude. Field evidence further complicated the myth. Reconstructions of the Amblev and Our rivers using archival aerial reconnaissance revealed the extent of destroyed bridges and frozen terrain, which had delayed both German advances and Allied counterattacks. Surveys in Bastogne measured trench depths of up to 1.5 meters and foxholes barely wide enough to accommodate 2 men, corroborating first-hand accounts of the winter's brutality. Veterans noted that vehicle tracks showed inconsistent movement, with Panthers bogged down in mud pockets and Sherman tanks immobilized for hours, details often excised in cinematic renderings. These test results confirmed that strategic victory was inseparable from operational improvisation, not mere heroics. Broader implications of post-war memory became evident as historians synthesized data and oral testimony. The Battle of the Bulge was recast as both moral and cultural symbol, shaping U.S. Army doctrine, Cold War propaganda, and German public memory. Reports highlighted that U.S. armored units retained operational readiness above 60%, despite extreme weather, whereas German units suffered up to 75% casualties in panzer divisions, illustrating contrasting approaches to logistics, discipline, and command philosophy. The battlefield's physical and psychological scars informed military education and historical scholarship, demonstrating how myth and memory coexist with documented fact. Additional layers emerged through comparative media analysis. Films, newsreels, and memoirs selectively emphasized specific heroics. The Stand of Easy Company, the role of C-47 resupply missions, and Patton's rapid advance to relieve Bastogne. Cold War narratives framed these events as emblematic of Western cohesion, while ignoring civilian suffering in towns like Stavelot and Trois-Ponts, where 53 homes had been destroyed and dozens of civilians killed. Archival documents, including the U.S. Army CMH Report No. 1949-12, contrasted operational reality with propaganda, revealing selective memory in both Allied and German post-war interpretations. Human consequences of the myth were as tangible as operational records. Veterans returning to Ardennes forests decades later found memorials emphasizing courage, often overlooking frostbite injuries, frozen casualties, and logistical desperation. Survivors noted that myths shaped public understanding, affecting pensions, recognition awards, and historical narrative. For instance, the valorization of Bastogne obscured the fact that over 45,000 soldiers suffered frostbite and nearly 100,000 German troops were immobilized or killed, shaping collective memory differently than operational reality. The interplay of heroism, propaganda, and memory created a layered historical identity, blending admiration and selective amnesia. By the late 1970s, historians and veterans alike recognized that the Bulge existed simultaneously as legend and lesson. Detailed studies of casualty reports, operational maps, and first-person interviews revealed that frozen terrain, supply improvisation, and coordinated reinforcements were as critical as individual heroism. The Cold War context amplified the narrative of Western unity, while minimizing tactical failures and moral ambiguity. Ultimately, the Battle of the Bulge serves as a cautionary tale about how history is remembered, truth shaped by snow, propaganda, and human interpretation, leaving echoes that endure far beyond the Ardennes forests themselves. Winter 2024, Bastogne, Belgium. A drone hovered over the circular memorial ring surrounding Place McAuliffe, its high-definition camera capturing the concentric rows of marble headstones, each engraved with names, ranks, and units of the fallen from the 101st Airborne and supporting formations. Snow crusted at a depth of 25 centimeters, drifting into foxholes that had once sheltered GIs from relentless artillery, while oak and beech trees, some exceeding 20 meters in height, swayed gently, their branches obscuring scars of tank tracks once pressed into the forest floor by panzer divisions. The memorial itself bore plaques, referencing 75 documented engagements between December 19, 1944 and January 25, 1945, alongside relief maps illustrating the Allied counteroffensive. Each stone reflected sunlight at precise angles, revealing engravings nearly obscured by lichen, a quiet testament to human endurance and organizational precision. Archaeologists carefully excavated a frozen relic near the Wilts River, uncovering an M1 Garand serial number 10988246, alongside fragments of a German MP-42 submachine gun, the metal oxidized yet intact beneath 40 centimeters of packed snow. Technical cataloging included weighing the Garand at 4 kilograms, measuring its barrel length at 60 centimeters, and noting the functional design differences compared to the MP-42's shorter 25 centimeter barrel and selective fire mechanism. Field reports from the Belgian Royal Institute of Cultural Heritage corroborated the find, linking it to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division based on ammunition casings stamped with the date December 22, 1944. Each item underwent X-ray imaging and metallurgical analysis, revealing stress fractures consistent with battlefield impact and winter freeze-thaw cycles. Comparative analysis between Allied and German equipment emphasized operational philosophy. Sherman tanks, although mechanically simpler, were maintained in larger numbers with modular repair kits, allowing crews to restore mobility within 3 to 4 hours, even in -10-degree temperatures. Panthers and Tigers, with 70 to 80-ton hulls and advanced Maybach engines producing 600 horsepower, offered superior firepower, but required extensive logistical support, rendering them vulnerable when fuel or repair crews were unavailable. The forest's uneven terrain amplified these differences. Shermans exploited narrower paths and tighter turning radii, while German armor often sank into snow-packed mud, immobilizing over 15 tanks per engagement in the northern sector. These operational disparities directly influenced both casualty rates and the pace of post-war recovery and commemoration. Field evidence confirmed the slow reclamation of the landscape. Drone surveys and LiDAR scans measured the fading outlines of tank tracks stretching over 3 kilometers, while soil samples indicated metal leaching from shells and vehicle hulls, altering local pH levels by as much as 15% in concentrated zones. Remnants of temporary bridges built from pine timbers were located along the Amblev River, decayed yet traceable through buried support posts spaced 2 meters apart, matching wartime engineering schematics from the German First SS Panzer Corps. Archaeological documentation revealed that over 40,000 unmarked graves remained scattered across the Ardennes, with coordinates confirmed against wartime cemetery maps held in the U.S. Army Center of Military History Archives. Broader implications became evident as memory and landscape intertwined. Belgian remembrance traditions, including annual wreath-laying ceremonies on December 24th and May 1st, reinforced collective memory, emphasizing valor, sacrifice, and endurance over strategic mistakes. Archival sound design incorporated recordings of distant thunder, morphing seamlessly into rolling artillery, creating an auditory bridge between past and present that illustrated the human experience of anticipation, fear, and perseverance. Analysis of these ceremonial practices suggested that memory construction was deliberate, balancing commemoration with a selective framing of historical events. Additional evidence emerged from veteran interviews and forensic studies. Oral histories captured survivors recounting frostbite, malnutrition, and the relentless winter, contrasting with post-war films that celebrated heroism without acknowledging logistical collapse. Modern forestry management, including replanting of native oak and beech species, obscured old defensive positions and trenches, demonstrating the forest's reclamation over 80 years while preserving subtle topographical anomalies. Comparative studies between Ardennes forests and similarly contested zones in the Hürtgen region revealed differences in vegetation density, artillery impact absorption, and soil composition, influencing both operational outcomes and long-term archaeological preservation. Human consequences of the silent battlefield were tangible and layered. The forest concealed both heroism and horror, from frozen infantry positions to abandoned supply caches containing food rations and medical supplies, often buried beneath 30 to 50 centimeters of soil and snow. Anthropological surveys documented microclimate effects on decomposition rates, revealing that cold, acidic soil slowed artifact decay by up to 30% compared to warmer European forests, preserving intimate traces of soldiers' lives and deaths. These findings emphasized that beneath quiet snow lay a tangible record of human decision-making, strategic error, and endurance, offering lessons for both military history and cultural memory. By spring 2025, analysis of drone imagery, archaeological finds, and archival research converged to reveal that the Ardennes forest functions as both memorial and living history. Tank tracks, grave sites, and scattered relics serve as markers of a winter campaign that tested human and mechanical limits, while ceremonial traditions and soundscapes maintain a dialogue between past and present. The quiet snow, covering 40,000 unmarked graves and reclaimed forest paths, embodies the echoes of ambition, courage, and delusion, a reminder that history persists beneath the surface, waiting for those who seek to discover, document, and remember. February 1st, 1945, Koblenz, Germany, columns of battered Wehrmacht units streamed across the crumbling bridges over the Rhine, their vehicles coated with ice and mud, tracks slipping into ruts, left by retreating Panzer IVs. Artillery fire still echoed faintly from the Westerwald hills, remnants of last skirmishes as the US 1st Infantry Division entered the northern sectors of the Siegfried Line. Each unit's strength had been decimated. The 1st SS Panzer Corps reported over 40% casualties, with 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and more than 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft grounded, stripped or shot down. Diaries from Feldwebel Klaus Mertens, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, describe men trudging through waist-deep snow with frost-bitten hands, their communications radios failing intermittently due to battery freezes. The Rhine itself, swollen from winter rains and snowmelt, mirrored the exhaustion of an empire teetering between strategic illusion and operational collapse. Technical examination of abandoned German armor revealed systemic failures that compounded battlefield losses. The Tiger II, weighing 71 tons with an 88mm Kawake 43 L71 gun, required up to 10 liters of oil per hour at idle, rendering it immobile for extended retreats in sub-zero temperatures. Field engineers documented over 100 instances of fuel line freezing in Panther OS. Gay units, reducing operational readiness to barely 20% in critical sectors. Allied Sherman tanks, despite inferior armor and a 75mm main gun, maintained operational integrity above 70% through standardized modular repair kits and distributed maintenance depots. Analysis of operational maps in the U.S. Army Center of Military History, catalogued under Report CMH 1946-12, confirmed that logistical attrition, not direct combat, accounted for nearly 50% of German armor losses during the Rhine withdrawal. Comparative studies of operational philosophy highlight stark differences between German and Allied approaches. The Wehrmacht prioritized concentrated firepower and heavy armor, exemplified by Tiger and Panther formations, but lacked redundancy and flexibility when fuel, spare parts, or trained crews were unavailable. In contrast, US units employed combined arms tactics, pairing medium tanks with mechanized infantry and portable artillery, allowing faster adaptation to terrain, weather, and enemy maneuver. The Ardennes winter amplified these contrasts. German units sank into snow-packed forests, while Sherman and M4A3 Lee tanks navigated narrow roads with lighter footprints. This disparity directly influenced casualty rates, with German losses exceeding 100,000 personnel, while Allied casualties, although heavy, remained proportionally lower at 75,000. Field evidence from the Siegfried Line documented both destruction and recovery. Engineers mapped collapsed bunkers and anti-tank obstacles using LiDAR, revealing tank craters ranging from 2 to 4 meters in diameter. Snowdrifts preserved personal effects, including identification tags, ration tins, and letters home, offering granular insight into individual soldier experience. Reports from the 3rd U.S. Army Archives recorded the capture of 75 operational Panther tanks in February 1945, many abandoned due to engine failure rather than enemy fire. Soil analysis indicated that metal leaching from artillery shells altered the local acidity, slowing decomposition and preserving weapons and ammunition for decades. These findings offered irrefutable proof that environmental and operational conditions shaped both human and material outcomes. The broader implications became evident as the Allies resumed their advance toward the Rhine in March 1945. Strategic maps demonstrated the erasure of the Bulge, the once prominent penetration in the Allied front, and indicated intact infrastructure facilitating rapid mechanized movement. Diaries from Lieutenant Colonel Robert McIntyre of the 9th Armored Division highlighted the psychological toll of advancing through snow-laden forests littered with abandoned German equipment and makeshift graves. The Ardennes Offensive, initially conceived as a last gamble for Hitler, had instead revealed the limits of human endurance, the fragility of centralized command, and the fatal consequences of overconfidence. Additional evidence emerged from post-war German and Allied analyses, memoirs of General Walther Wenck, and reports in the Bundesarchiv document the collapse of reserve units and the inability of the Luftwaffe to provide air cover, with over 1,000 aircraft lost or rendered inoperable. Allied aerial reconnaissance, including photographs dated February 5, 1945, captured destroyed bridges, burned convoys, and frozen artillery positions, corroborating first-hand accounts. Comparative assessments of supply chain efficiency demonstrated that while U.S. logistics allowed replacement of 200 tanks per week, German production and distribution lagged, forcing abandonment of high-value equipment. These data reinforced that the Ardennes failure was as much an operational catastrophe as it was a symbolic one, exposing systemic weaknesses in the Reich's military-industrial complex. The human and operational consequences were staggering. Frostbite, exhaustion, and combat fatigue incapacitated thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers even before reaching the Rhine, while remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Corps faced hasty court-martials and disciplinary actions for abandoning equipment. Allied troops documented field hospitals treating over 10,000 cases of cold-related injuries and combat wounds, reflecting the compounded effect of winter, terrain, and relentless pursuit. Personal diaries, such as those of Private Thomas Riley of the 87th Infantry Division, describe the surreal transition from intense combat to encountering desolate forests marked by abandoned weaponry and frozen bodies, forcing reflection on both the cost of war and the resilience of those who survived. By the close of February 1945, the Ardennes stood as both a historical and symbolic turning point. The Reich, depleted of resources, manpower, and morale, had gambled on a winter offensive and paid the ultimate price. The Rhine, crossed with relative ease by US and British forces in early March, symbolized both geographical and strategic victory. Diaries, maps, and preserved battlefields show the full arc from Hitler's map table in Berlin to snow-covered graves across Bastogne and Malmedy. The campaign illustrated the lethal intersection of ambition, illusion, and human endurance. The Ardennes Offensive, the winter that broke the Reich, thus concluded not with grand triumph, but with the quiet inevitability of a collapsing empire.